Hi everyone, please subscribe to my channel. Blood Immortal Venerable. See playlist for other chapters and novels. I do not translate the novels. Credits goes to original translator and author of the novel. I only make it as an audiobook so it would be easier to just listen while doing other things. Credits goes to the author of the novel. I convert stories to audiobook for mental health, for multitasking purpose, for accessibility and time saving. Listening to audiobook is also beneficial for people who have disability. It improves our listening skills and improve our English comprehension, vocabulary and other things. So, thank you for listening. Thank you and thank you very much for your support. Chapter 2581, A Fight. Fortunately, Kenom lived alone in his house, far from his family. If other people had been living there, they would all have died, crushed under Baber's feet. As Kenom looked over at the old man a small distance away, he realized that Baber was a powerful warrior at the other shore realm. He could not understand why this old man hated him so much. He racked his brain for any way he could have offended him, but Zen's voice cut his thoughts short. This person is probably a relative of the man in purple, Zen said seriously. Pulling a long face, Kenom frowned. He relaxed his face within a few seconds, however, consoling himself with the thought that he hadn't, after all, killed the man in purple. Knowing that there was no way for him to escape, he had no choice but to step forward. He cupped his hands and said to the old man, "Sir, my name is Kenom Lai. Forgive me if it is due to a lapse in my memory, but I don't think we have ever met before. I am wondering why you came to me." Baber had spent the past few days in a blind rage since he learned of his grandson's death. He could only speculate who or what had actually killed his grandson. He thought it might have been the ghost. However, no matter what the true identity of the killer was, he knew for a fact that the dead body of his grandson had been destroyed by Kenom and his friends. That was enough for Baber to desire their deaths. Before the shaking Kenom could even finish his sentence, a green shadow, shaped like a human hand, appeared on Baber's own right hand. The shadow reached out towards Kenom, who immediately felt an intense pressure on his entire body. Kenom was completely paralyzed. Then, he was pulled towards the old man like metal to a magnet. As Kenom was being pulled forward, Zen stepped forward and harnessed the strength source within his body. He touched Kenom lightly with one hand, using the power shaping to form an invisible piece of armor which pinned him to the ground. Baber looked shocked. He had not expected to fail in such a simple task. Even Baber's guards, who usually showed no emotion, looked surprised. "Master Baber didn't use all of his strength, did he?" one of them asked. "This brat actually has the power to resist. Nice try, boy, don't be too confident in your pathetic skills." These guards were handpicked from the elites of the Chi clan. Most of them were also consummate true gods that had entered the Sea of Truth, and they were almost on par with Zen in cultivation level. They were curious to see how Zen was able to resist Baber's magnetic pull. "Sir, if you have a score to settle with Kenom, you can tell us first. Why would you want to fight him?" Zen said dismissively. Although Baber was surprised at Zen's strength, Zen's words were not enough to stop him. Why should I explain myself to you, or anyone?" he scoffed. The green palm shadow on his right hand flitted slightly, and a strong aura bloomed from it. "The aura of the other shore token and divine crystals," Zen murmured. As he watched the aura spread, he raised his eyebrows. He had met many powerful warriors at the other shore realm and he could tell immediately that the green hand shadow the old man was using was his other shore token. However, this token was much weaker than those demonstrated by Emily and the others. Nevertheless, Baber was a force to contend with. The pressure from the blooming aura was very high, even to Zen. Kenom, meanwhile, stood still, his face ashen. The tomb was his only chance, possibly, to climb the social ladder and enter a large sect. Even though he had obtained it accidentally, he had gotten himself into big trouble. If the other shore realm master decided to kill him, there would be no escaping death. Unbeknownst to him, some true gods were hiding in the buildings surrounding Kenom's now destroyed house, observing the scene that now unfolded. They all somehow felt sympathy for him, even though they were not friends. Being residents of the excellent city, they more or less knew Kenom, a consummate true god. Swish, the green hand shadow suddenly expanded like a devil's claw, before sweeping down, aiming at Kenom's head. Kenom stood with bated breath, eyes closed, resigned to accepting his apparently inevitable death. However, instead of the fatal blow he was expecting to his head, he felt a hand grab him by the shoulder. With a flash of his eyes, Zen had pulled Kenom back by the shoulder, forcibly launching him backwards, away from the huge green hand about to deliver the death blow. Waves blending energy. The colorful burst of energy quickly took the shape of a palm that then hurtled towards the hand shadow. At the sight of Zen's retaliation to his attack, Baber's lips contorted into a sarcastic grimace. Does a pathetic consummate true god like him really think he has a chance against me? I am an Other Shore Realm warrior. How naive, he thought to himself. Although Baber was only in the first stage of the Other Shore Realm, there was a large gap in understanding and control of energy between an Other Shore Realm warrior and a true god. The second the palms of the two hands touched each other in midair, Zen's was crushed as easily as if it were made of paper or dry weeds. The old man's power turned out to be invincible. Nobody looked surprised. Zen, however, did not give up. Staring at the palm in the air, he gave a single command. Break. Bang. When crushed like this, the wave's blending energy lost a lot of its power. It could only release its destructive power when unrestrained. The moment Zen's palm broke, it emitted a streak of blinding light which engulfed Baber's palm shadow completely. Meanwhile, in the city lord's mansion, the lord of the Excellence City was taken aback at the sight of the pale-faced woman. He immediately hurried forward and bowed to her. Master Laura, we are honored to have you, but may I ask why you are here? He asked, not even daring to look up at her. Are you leaving the source world? There was the chaos beyond the source world. He could not, for the life of him, imagine a reason why this woman would ever want to come his small city. So he reasoned that she was just passing through, probably taking a shortcut to the Wild Goose Pass. A man called qartulad discovered the tomb of a stinger guard, she said calmly, with a glance at the bowing lord. I am here to take him back. So, take me to meet him. The tomb of a stinger guard? The lord thought, perplexed. Realizing the importance and urgency of this woman's mission, the city lord immediately sent his men after qartulad, or at least news of him. After he had done that, he led the woman to the west of the city. At the midpoint of their journey, they encountered a burst of light, bright and intense as a solar flare. The aura of the energy coming off this light was very strange. The city lord thought for a second that it seemed to be similar to an internal momentum created by a true god, but it also seemed much more powerful than that. When the pale-faced woman and the three men in cyan saw the light, they also looked confused. What kind of theurgy is this? One of them said. It's not the internal momentum of an Other Shore Realm warrior. It seems to be a true god's, said another. What godly way is it? It's so powerful. These Other Shore Realm warriors had also been true gods once. However, to them, cultivating the godly ways was a formality, a mere means to reach the Other Shore Realm. It was no surprise that they had little understanding of the energy of the godly ways. It is the ways blending energy, the pale-faced woman said in a low voice. Her eyes glimmered with curiosity. And whoever is responsible for this seems to have blended a great many of godly ways together. Chapter 2582, Go to Perdition. The masters who had reached the Other Shore Realm more or less knew about the fusion of the godly ways. The fusion of the godly ways did increase the strength of the true gods, but at that point there was a better choice for them, which was to reach the other shore. Who would waste time on this kind of a thing? Occasionally, there would be a few talents who tried to merge 3 to 5 godly ways, but these were just casual attempts. Their only goal was to test their own talents. Later, they would concentrate on the truth of godly way. The pale-faced woman had never seen so many godly ways merged together. She estimated that there must be at least 1,000 of them. She had never seen anyone in the Swordlight Palace who was able to cultivate so many godly ways. Who are fighting in the Excellence City? The Lord of the Excellence City demanded. He sped up and carried forward as he didn't care about the fusion of the godly ways. The small Excellence City was under his jurisdiction. After being thrown out by Zen, qartulad landed heavily on the ground. When he got up and looked around, he found that the place before him was enveloped in strong light. When the light gradually dissipated, his eyes widened in amazement. Not far away, Zen stood still, and the green hand of the old man disappeared without a trace. I can't believe that this guy is able to bear the theurgy of an opponent at the Other Shore Realm. He thought in disbelief. The guards brought by Baber all took a deep breath. The seemingly inconspicuous consummate true god had single-handedly blocked Baber's attack. Baber had used his Other Shore token and it was an all-out blow from a master at the Other Shore Realm. Baber, who was standing in front of Zen, was more shocked than anyone else. His emerald palm shadow was also a good Other Shore token. He was very confident of the power of the attack that he had just aimed at Zen, but the attack was soon defended by the young warrior who was a mere true god. His face was as white as a sheet. On the other hand, Zen's expression was as calm as usual. After all, he had killed several warriors at the Other Shore Realm in the Divine Land. Even someone as powerful as Clement had been killed by Zen. Of course, he had relied on the power of the divine land itself to kill Clement. However, just because Zen was able to block the old man's attack did not mean he could win. He had no choice but to fight back just now. Great, how dare you, a mere true god, challenge me? Baber's countenance returned to normal, and a hint of danger was evident in his old eyes. Zen lifted his feet, preparing to flee. He knew that the old man was serious. If he couldn't defeat the old man, he would have to escape. In truth, he was not really afraid of the old man. It was not easy for the old warrior to defeat Zen either, especially since Zen had the latent Thurges as hidden weapons. Just then, Kenom suddenly rushed to stand between him and Zen to protect Zen. He shouted, "Zen, you'd better flee quickly. I am responsible for this disaster after all, and it has nothing to do with you." Zen was slightly moved by Kenom's gesture. Although Kenom was not a powerful man, he was loyal to his friends. "Neither of you can leave." Baber spat. How could he let them escape? He raised his hands gently and two green palm shadows appeared on his hands once more. The power that emanated from them was fiercer than before. Just as Baber was about to make his move, a woman in a cyan robe gently floated down from the air. Her pale lips parted, and she said weakly, "May I know who Kenom Lai is? I have heard that he has obtained the personal effects of our deceased Stinger guard." The look on Baber's face suddenly changed when he heard this voice. The gracious province was a small one, so they didn't have any super big force. The talented people in the province therefore hoped to join the Sword Light Palace in the neighboring province. The legend of the Stinger guards had spread throughout the gracious province. When Baber got news from the Mice League, he also spotted the Stinger guard's tomb and his cyan sword. His purpose of coming to Kenom was to avenge his grandson. But at the same time, he also needed to find the Stinger guard's personal effects. However, this was a serious matter, so he would not share this information with others. However, people from the Sword Light Palace arrived before he could kill Kenom. It all happened so fast. Baber frowned and made an instant decision. He stretched out his hands gently, and those two dark green hand shadows crawled towards Kenom like two great pythons. It was obvious that the old man planned to kill Kenom before the people from the Sword Light Palace found out who Kenom was. However, Kenom was such a stubborn man that he would rather die than drag Zen into this. He stayed put, unwilling to leave. Zen was about to throw Kenom out again when the eyes of the woman flashed slightly. No one saw her use any Thurgi, but the two green palm shadows released by Baber vanished without a trace. This kind of turn of events was quite strange, and even Zen was stunned. The pale-faced woman glanced at Baber and said angrily, "Trying to kill someone in front of me? How dare you? Fine, go to perdition." Everyone heard her weak voice. It was a voice that didn't make them feel threatened, but instead it soothed them. But it had the opposite effect on Baber. She intended to kill him, though this was the first time they had met. He paused for a while before raising his head and announcing, "I'm from the Chi clan of the Flame City." As words left his mouth, he felt a slight shiver. The ashen woman stretched out 3 fingers to touch him. She said softly, "I won't listen to your nonsense." When she gently pinched her fingers, the sound of the mirror smashing was heard by everyone. Baber's body crumbled into several pieces like a porcelain vase and scattered on the ground. It was indeed a miserable death, but not even a single drop of blood was shed. If one looked at his broken body carefully, they would see that the cuts on the flesh were as smooth as a mirror. The guards of Chi clan, who were watching the entire drama, were so shocked that they didn't even dare to breathe. Even Baber himself had no room for resistance. How could the guards dare to move? Kenom, too, was stunned. He didn't answer the woman until she fell from the air. I am Kenom Lai, and the Stinger guard's personal effects are here," he stuttered. He quickly removed the cyan sword from his space ring, walked 2 steps forward and presented it to the woman. The woman took the cyan sword and held it in her hands for a while. She gently rubbed the blade with her bloodless fingers. Although the cyan sword was very old, it was still sharp and immediately cut her finger. Chapter 2583, An Exorbitant Reward. With blood flowing down along its edge, the quaint cyan sword started glowing once again. The sword released a sharp aura. As Zen saw this, his eyelids twitched as fear gripped his heart. He felt afraid that the cyan sword would cut him in half. This is the truth of eternal sword intent contained in the cyan sword, Zen thought. In order to get the sword from inside the cave, Zen had risked his life fighting for it. He even got injured before he successfully got a hold of the sword. Since this sword was activated by this pale-faced woman, the power of the truth of eternal sword intent might have increased by 100 times. Approaching it recklessly would probably have Zen cut into pieces by the truth of eternal sword intent alone. He wondered how powerful the owner of the cyan sword was. Buzz. After it absorbed the woman's blood, a bloodline was left on its blade. As the bloodline gathered on its blade, dots of blood red light started to glow one by one gradually. Looking at the dots of blood on the glowing sword, Kenom and the Lord of the Excellent City were surprised, their eyes wide open. The standard sword in the Sword Light Palace was the Blood Kill sword. Every Stinger Guard possessed this type of sword, and a dot of blood red light on it meant that its owner was a 1-star Stinger Guard. It was also a secret known to most of the people in the Excellent City, even in the Gracious Province. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As Kenom counted the number of blood light dots on the sword, his mouth couldn't help twitching. Even the city lord's heart thumped wildly in his chest. If a 5-star Stinger Guard's tomb was excavated, and their personal effects were handed over to the Swordlight Palace, the excavator could get 5 places in the Swordlight Palace. It was rare for anyone to get so many places at one time. Even the Lord of the Excellent City could not ignore such a chance to earn a place. It's actually a 5-star Stinger Guard. Kenom felt completely flabbergasted, his face reflected an indescribable expression. Previously, he thought a 1-star Stinger Guard would bring him satisfaction. At least, he could enter the Swordlight Palace. Never in his wildest dream did he expect what he had found was a 5-star Stinger Guard's tomb. The Lord of the Excellent City couldn't help but step forward before he bowed to the woman. "Master Laura, is this a 5-star Stinger Guard's sword?" he asked. Staring at the cyan sword, the pale-faced woman shook her head and replied, "No. This is not a 5-star Stinger Guard." Both Kenom and the city lord who heard her were slightly stunned. With a gleam flashing in Zen's eyes, he suddenly thought of the ghost in the tomb. After getting along with number 9527 for a long time, Zen realized that it gradually became lazy. It rarely came out to help him, unless he really encountered a life-and-death situation. That ghost continuously grew under the siege of the young master of the Chi clan and his group, but Zen wasn't sure on the extent of its growth. So before it could grow any further, number 9527 had destroyed the obsession of the Stinger Guard and made it possible for Zen to obtain the cyan sword. This feat was mostly attributed to number 9527, not Zen. If it wasn't for number 9527, no one would know what the ghost would grow into in the end. The pale-faced woman couldn't hide her sad expression as she said, "It's the former leader of our Swordlight Palace, Caspian Chu." The Lord of the Excellent City trembled upon hearing her statement. Stammering, he said, "It's been so many years since Master Caspian disappeared. I didn't expect that he actually died in our gracious province." The Swordlight Palace was a powerful force that was very famous in the whole province. Its leader, Caspian Chu, certainly enjoyed a high status. However, more than 500 years ago, Caspian Chu suddenly disappeared. Over the years, his position remained vacant and the vice leader served as the acting leader. The Lord of the Excellent City never expected that the leader of the Swordlight Palace had died in the gracious province. On the other hand, Kenom remained astonished by the fact that he found the tomb of the leader of the Swordlight Palace. He felt like he was in Cloud 9. At the same time, a spark of hope started to warm his heart as he wondered what reward awaited for him in the Swordlight Palace. Zen's heart also skipped a beat. In addition to the cyan sword, a few other effects were also left in Caspian Chu's tomb. There was a cyan suit, a pair of boots, a hat, and the octagonal copper sheet. He hadn't asked Jeffrey to identify the copper sheet yet, but it seemed that he needed to hurry up to proceed the matter. Although the map in the copper sheet still remained to be a puzzle for him, he knew that there was something special about it. Otherwise, why would a leader of a powerful force keep it? Putting away the cyan sword, the pale-faced woman stared at Kenom and said in a weak voice, "Our Swordlight Palace indeed have a rule that anyone who can get back the effects of a Stinger Guard will be qualified to join our Swordlight Palace. Finding the effects of a 5-star Stinger Guard could get you 5 tickets. You brought back the effects of the owner of this sword. We'll give you 10 tickets." Although she spoke intermittently, every word sounded crystal clear to Kenom. However, he felt a little disappointed. He only needed 1 ticket. Counting in Zen and his 3 friends, he would only need 5. So where could he use the other 5 more tickets? Moreover, 500 years ago we offered anyone who could find the leader a reward. You can claim it, the woman continued. Shortly after the woman finished talking, Kenom's heart thumped wildly. It felt like a heavy hammer hit it ceaselessly. Stammering, he asked, "Excuse me, what's the reward?" The woman looked at him and then calmly replied, "A wealth probably equivalent to 50 times the wealth of the Excellent City." Hearing her words, the guards of the Qi clan all gasped in astonishment. Pausing in the air, they couldn't decide if they would stay or go. The lord of the Excellence City was also flabbergasted. The Excellence City was indeed a small city in the Gracious Province. However, being nearest to the Wild Goose Pass, and having the East Port, the flow of people and scale of trade were not small. Therefore, the overall wealth of all the people in the area was definitely not a small amount. Just the mere thought of 50 times the wealth of the Excellence City would make anyone feel dizzy. Kenom was afraid that he would faint as he set his mind on it. Shifting her attention to Zen, the pale-faced woman stared at him with a strange expression. Through her sad eyes, she asked, "You seem to have no psychological fluctuation." Of course, Zen did not have much psychological fluctuation and his expression remained very serene. The Sword Light Palace was, after all, a big force. The reward offered for finding the former leader was quite high and promising. However, the divine crystals that Zen received were the heritage of the entire Nine Li race. Although he only took half of it, it was still an astronomical amount. So hearing this now from the lady, Zen was not shocked at all. On another hand, Zen was busy analyzing the turn of events. Knowing that Kenom was not powerful enough and his talent was far from enough to attract the attention of the Sword Light Palace, Zen assumed that getting such a great fortune might not be advantageous on his end. Instead, it would be a disaster. Rich as Zen was, only a few people like Emily and Leopold knew it. If Kenom went to the Sword Light Palace to claim his reward, he would be killed in less than 2 hours after leaving the Sword Light Palace. What was more, it was very likely that the person who would do that was from the Sword Light Palace. Chapter 2584, The Qualified People. Zen hadn't expected this woman to pay attention to him. After all, it was Kenom who had presented the cyan sword to her, not Zen. She shouldn't have reacted that way. After thinking for a while, Zen immediately put on a worried look and said, "This huge reward is indeed amazing. I'm just worried that Kenom may not be able to bear it. As the saying goes, an innocent man gets into trouble because of his wealth." The pale woman looked at Zen and thoughtfully asked, "So you're worried about this?" "Well, it's not a difficult problem. I can only give him a part of it for the time being. But you were right, if all the reward is given to Kenom, I'm afraid that many people from the Sword Light Palace will be tempted to rob him." Nervousness was written all over Kenom's face. He looked at the woman and asked anxiously, "Then what should I do?" The pale woman glanced at him indifferently and looked away. She said, "What should you do? That has nothing to do with me. If you can find 10 people, I will take you on the journey. However, I will only wait for 1 day." With that, she floated in the air and left. The 3 men from the Sword Light Palace followed her too. Worried about being seen as a poor host, the Lord of the Excellence City also left to follow them. Only Zen, Kenom and the guards of the Qi clan remained. These guards couldn't dare to take revenge. They were sure that the woman would not trouble them, so they, too, escaped quickly one by one. Kenom was worried sick by now. The more he thought about Zen's words, the more he was convinced. He asked, "Zen, what should I do?" Zen smiled and comforted him, "Don't worry too much, Kenom. The reward of the Sword Light Palace is very valuable, but you can refuse it." "What, refuse it?" Kenom was shocked to hear this. The reward was enough to make the Lai clan a formidable force in the entire Gracious Province. Nobody would refuse it casually. Hesitation and pain were written all over his face. "After all, you've attained your goal of getting the tomb and joining the Sword Light Palace, haven't you? If you are obsessed with this wealth, it will only bring you trouble, and even cause a fatal disaster." Zen continued with his warning. He could only advise Kenom to keep his well-being in mind, but he couldn't interfere with Kenom's final decision. Human beings died in pursuit of wealth, and birds died in pursuit of food. Even the true God was no exception. It was just that the wealth in their case was divine crystals. Not everyone was able to resist the temptation of large wealth. In addition to that, Kenom got 10 places in the Sword Light Palace. The news spread like wildfire and attracted the attention of all the clans in the Excellent City. Dozens of clan leaders paid a visit to Kenom hoping to buy a place from him. After making arrangements for the 4 people of the Sword Light Palace, the Lord of the Excellent City went back in the hope that he would get at least 1 or 2 places from Kenom. Kenom had not forgotten his friends who had gone to the cave with him that day. They were all ecstatic about the news. Although they didn't help much, they had risked their lives anyway and that was a big deal. The qualification of being able to enter the Sword Light Palace was the best reward for them. Zen didn't need one of the places, but Kenom insisted on giving him one. When Zen refused to accept it, the lord of the excellent city said, "Zen, I have a message for you from Master Laura." "What is it?" Zen was a little puzzled. He couldn't understand why Laura had asked the lord of the excellent city to bring him a message. Master Laura said that if you went to the Swordlight Palace, she would assign you a special place, and if you stay in the Gracious Province, the Chi clan will seek revenge against you. If they send people to go after you, you might be in big trouble, said the lord of the excellent city. Zen's eyes narrowed slightly. Laura's message was subtle, but there was obviously a hint of coercion in it. But why did that woman want Zen to join the Swordlight Palace? If Zen really wanted to join a big force, there were better choices. Even though the Pear Hill was far away from here, he would have arrived there after a long time if he insisted on going there. Not only would he be able to get protection from Emily, but he would also be able to stay with Yan. Zen was about to reject firmly when number 9527 suddenly said, "Zen, say yes." "What do you mean? Why?" Zen asked. In fact, Zen had repeatedly asked what Chiyu had spoken to number 9527, but the latter refused to tell him, so he didn't know what to do. But now number 9527 was asking him to join the Swordlight Palace. "Just listen to me," continued number 9527. "But you haven't told me the reason yet." Zen was a little uncertain and dissatisfied. "But this is what Chiyu wanted you to do. So, I'll make a plan for your future route," number 9527 grinned. "What do you think I am?" Zen's face darkened. "Why, you're just a chess piece," number 9527 joked. "Why don't you get lost?" Zen reluctantly agreed despite not knowing its true plan. Convincing Zen was a mission from Laura. When Zen changed his mind and agreed, the lord of the excellent city was finally relieved. He surmised that Laura had asked Zen to join the Swordlight Palace because he had performed the merging of godly ways. When a man could merge so many godly ways, he must be talented even if he hadn't reached the other shore realm. Of course, a true god lived on forever. It wouldn't be a big deal when Zen practiced several hundred or thousand godly ways if he was tens of millions of years old, or even hundreds of millions of years old. But this guy was less than 200 years old. There were 6 places left with Kenom after Zen was specially given a place by the woman. 2 of the 6 places were allocated to the members of the Lai clan, 2 to the lord of the excellent city, and the other 2 to the 2 big clans of the excellent city. So everyone could be happy. The Lai clan was not a big clan in the excellent city, so it was likely that it would now gain prominence thanks to Kenom. The following day, in the east port of the excellent city, the lord of the excellent city was seeing those people off with his subordinates. The pale woman held the long cyan sword in her hand, and there was an indelible sadness in her eyes. She did not reveal the fact that the owner of the cyan sword was her own father. Hundreds of years had passed, and her grief had already subsided, but many parties were involved in her father's death. If this sword was taken back to the Swordlight Palace now, she would have to suffer a lot. As she was reflecting on this, her gaze swept down the large flying ship and finally landed on Zen. In her eyes, he was the only one who had the qualifications to enter the Swordlight Palace among the 11 people who got the places. He was her only hope. Chapter 2585, The Country of the Man-Eating Demon Flowers. As soon as the group led by Kenom set foot on the flying ship, excitement overwhelmed each of them. A brand new life was promised for them at the end of the trip. The Swordlight Palace did not give them much time to prepare. They were instructed to travel as soon as possible. After they got the news to set off, they all hurriedly bid goodbye to their families. The cyan flying ship of the Swordlight Palace was majestically decorated. The wood that made the railings of the ship revealed natural patterns. Such a rare wood naturally highlighted the outlines of the ship. The natural patterns were said to calm people's minds. After the group stepped on the ship, they found that everything on the flying ship seemed to be exquisite. The ship was designed to be comfortable for most people. However, most of the 11 consummate true gods who got the licenses to enter the Swordlight Palace looked restrained after they got on the ship. Kenom and his friends even walked on tiptoes. It seemed like such a luxurious place made them uncomfortable. Only Zen was able to maintain his calm as he gave no interest in the facilities. After all, the divine land itself was a flying ship. With such a long experience in that place, he grew accustomed to its features. Additionally, he had personally controlled such a huge flying ship. As such, when he saw the other flying ships, they were rather insignificant in his eyes. Moreover, the flying ship of Swordlight Palace could not compare to the trumpet flying ship. Everyone boarded the cyan flying ship safely. Afterward, one of the men in cyan shouted with an official tone, "Set off." A slight shake signaled the takeoff of the flying ship. The majestic cyan flying ship left the east port silently. The flight started with fair weather. The huge Excellence City quickly grew smaller in the distance. Soon, the flying ship carried everyone into the sky and flew forward at high speed. Zen stood on the side of the ship with a callous expression. Because of the clear skies, he was able to look down at the scene below. Even though he was in the air and was over 100,000 feet high, everything around that he saw was still yellow and hazy. It's still the desert outside the Excellence City. Zen's eyes narrowed as he examined the area below. Suddenly, some dust blocked his vision. Above the desert floated a massive sandstorm. With his experience, Zen immediately realized that the sandstorm was caused by a man-eating demon flower. If there was still the vast desert around Excellence City, then the circumstances would be unfavorable to the evil god. A few days ago, he let go of the evil god. However, the evil god did not choose to enter Excellence City but left along the big river instead. At that moment, as he looked down from the sky, he saw that the river stretched for hundreds of miles before it finally disappeared into the desert. However, as he looked at the river, he concluded that the evil god hadn't encountered any danger. After all, if the evil god died, he would be reborn in the rebirth land, inside Zen's body. You seem to be very interested in the gracious province. A weak voice behind Zen said softly. Suddenly, the pale-faced woman slowly approached him from his side. With her thin arms, she leaned on the rail as if she had no strength. A nostalgic pair of eyes decorated her face and she also looked down at the scenery below. That desert looks so vast. Where will it end? Asked Zen as he stared far into the distance. The pale-faced woman blinked her eyes at Zen's query. With a gentle wave of her hand, she pointed out to the air and said, "The entire gracious province is mostly desert. Here is the Aramopoa Desert. That right there is the Sunset Desert. Over there. The gracious province has such a tough environment. That's pretty harsh." Zen was slightly stunned as he processed some new information. A faint smile appeared on the face of the woman. With a suggestive tone, she answered, "What else do you think otherwise? No one would be willing to give up this province. This desert is a harsh place. There is only sand and nothing more." Zen simmered in deep thought as he heard such a miserable statement. A recent memory came to Zen's mind. It was when Kenelm told him the reason why no big force controlled the gracious province. He said because of the Wild Goose Pass, no big sect was allowed to occupy this province. Zen had once doubted the words. When he heard the explanation of the woman, he concluded that it was much closer to the true reason. It turned out that the gracious province was too barren. Therefore, the great powers were simply uninterested in the place. You are not a local in the gracious province, right?" continued the pale-faced woman with a curious expression. The question that Zen had always tried to avoid finally came. As he tried to hide his worry, his eyes flickered. Of course, he had predicted that the Swordlight Palace would question him about his identity. As such, he had already prepared a set of excuses. "Yes, I am indeed not," said Zen confidently as he nodded. He waited for the woman to continue her questions. However, he didn't expect that the conversation would suddenly stop there. Zen's set of excuses didn't even come into use. On the flying ship, Kenelm and the others of the group sat on one side, and the three men in cyan stood at the bow to control the ship. Apart from the sound of wind caused when the ship flew at a high speed, it was very quiet on the ship. At that moment, Zen's eyes flashed as he looked curiously down below. That's. The sand below suddenly blew violently upward. There was an unprecedented storm in the desert. The area the huge sandstorm covered was vastly beyond Zen's imagination. In the center of the sandstorm, there seemed to be a large city. "The city of the people living in the sand," the woman said indifferently as she looked down. With a grim look, Zen thought of the people in the sweltering desert and asked, "Do these people really have their own country?" "Country?" The woman shook her head slightly as her face revealed some pity. "That is not the country of those people living in the sand. Unfortunately, something else rules the place. That's the country of man-eating demon flowers. Look." Zen looked in the direction where the woman's finger pointed. Even though he was hundreds of thousands of feet away, Zen still saw many huge man-eating demon flowers in the city. Moreover, they were more than 1,000 times bigger than the one he had seen before. Each man-eating demon flower was like a giant monster that prostrated on the ground. All 7 heads of each flower looked at different directions. Zen was really shocked as he witnessed the monstrosities below. With widened eyes, he asked, "How can these man-eating demon flowers be so huge?" "Huge." Look once again carefully. As her eyes shifted to the other side, the pale-faced woman made Zen look towards a horrendous scene. Zen's eyes narrowed greatly as he clicked his tongue. Tens of thousands of miles away in front of the flying ship stood an even bigger man-eating demon flower. The man-eating demon flower was probably over 10,000 miles high. Moreover, its huge body was still curled up on the ground. If it stretched its body, it would probably be more than 100,000 miles long. That is the king of the man-eating demon flowers. It has already entered the 15th stage of the other shore realm. The whole sand country is under its control. Such a monster governs the vast desert. It is the true ruler of the entire gracious province, said the woman with a dejected look. A plant can actually reach the other shore realm and grow to such an extent. How can that be? Zen was stunned as his eyes fixated on the king of the man-eating demon flowers. The woman smiled faintly. A nostalgic glimmer appeared in her eyes. In this world there are many weirder things. But there are so many man-eating demon flowers. What do they live on? Zen asked with a curious expression. Since the man-eating demon flowers had established a huge country, the number of man-eating demon flowers was naturally huge. It was impossible to feed themselves only with outsiders that the people living in the sand brought to them. Their food is the people living in the sand. Such is the harsh reality of this place. A rather cold and determined look painted the woman's face as she answered Zen's question. They prey upon the people living in the sand. Why don't those people just run away? Zen clenched his fist as his conscience was touched by guilt. He had killed a few people living in the sand that had deceived him. Although he was not the savior, they were still all human beings as he was. The woman looked at Zen indifferently and said, "You are really not from the source world." In Zen's subconsciousness, the human race should dominate the world. The other fierce beasts and monsters should be inferior to humans and they couldn't surpass humans. It was an agreed rule both in the universes and in the divine land. However, that was not the case in the source world. The human race was limited to a few big forces, while the races formed by fierce beasts and monsters were the mainstream of the source world. Chapter 2586, The Unknown Fire. After Zen entered the Wild Goose Pass, he had met the Mice League and the man-eating demon flower. However, he had always believed in the dominance of humans, so it was difficult for him to accept the case in the source world. Although the people of the Swordlight Palace did not show any interest in occupying the gracious province, they had once sent their warriors to exterminate the man-eating demon flowers in the province. Although unable to move, the man-eating demon flower reproduced rapidly. Every man-eating demon flower could produce millions of seeds, and they could thrive even in such harsh environments like the desert. They would be seen everywhere again several years after the Swordlight Palace had exterminated them. 30,000 years ago, the Swordlight Palace had no time to pay attention to the gracious province due to its own problems. Therefore, a man-eating demon flower had insidiously reached the other shore realm and kept growing. As time went by, it integrated another shore token from the stage 15, becoming the king of the man-eating demon flowers. As a result, the monstrous flower and its seeds became even more difficult to eradicate. The man-eating demon flowers were very intelligent, and they used a unique system to support people of the Sand Country, who worshipped the flowers as gods. A large number of Sand Country folks willingly offered themselves as sacrifices to the beastly blooms because they considered it a supreme honor to do so. The Swordlight Palace tried to stop people of the Sand Country, but the people considered them as enemies and attacked them. In the end, the palace could only let the man-eating demon flowers grow widely in the desert. Perhaps, they mistake our goodwill for ill intent. The woman named Laura murmured. The deathly pallor of her skin had been replaced by the faintest flush of color, making her look radiant. She did not force Zen to tell her where he came from but went on explaining to him the structure of the gracious province. After she finished, Zen sighed. It seemed like the source world was much more complicated than he had originally surmised. Will the king of man-eating demon flowers attack us? Zen looked ahead with a hint of worry in his eyes. The man-eating demon flower's body stretched for as long as 100,000 miles. If it raised its body high in the air, it could tear the flying ship into pieces. It is powerful enough to rule the world here, but it doesn't dare to provoke the ships flying past. It won't deliberately antagonize us or the influential caravans, because it knows that it will get into trouble with us by doing so. It's not stupid, Laura said with a smile. Her excitement drove her to speak much more fluently than before. The three men garbed in cyan robes in the front of the flying ship stared at them, murmuring inwardly. In their opinion, Zen was nobody special, just someone who had cultivated a lot of godly ways. That meant nothing. In the source world, reaching the other shore realm was the real starting point. They were curious as to why Laura, who was generally not a talkative character, continued talking with Zen. Not long after, the flying ship finally passed the colossal king of man-eating demon flowers. Waves of space spread out around the flying ship, enveloping it. Then, the flying ship entered the void. The gracious province was small, but its space was astonishingly large. To save time, they had to use grand teleportation. A clear river flowed in front of the excellent city. The sweet, refreshing water fed many divine citizens around the city. The Aramopoa Desert was located at the end of the river. The evil god walked along the edge of the dune. He narrowed his eyes and let the hot sand kiss his face. "Excuse me, sir, can you take me to the excellent city?" A man's voice interrupted the evil god's reverie. The man looked very weak and exhausted. He was panting for breath, and his lips were dry and cracked. Standing beside the dune, the evil god looked the man up and down with an indescribable expression in his eyes. "Sir." The man crawled slowly on the dune and finally reached the feet of the evil god. "Help me, I have no energy left." The evil god kept looking at the man, saying nothing. Then, a wicked smile appeared on his handsome face. "Interesting. The human beings in the outside world are the same. They also lie." What do you mean?" the man asked in a faint voice. "What a cheap trick." The evil god didn't bother to explain how he saw through the man's ruse. As he opened his mouth, a ruthless aura burst out from him. He slowly squatted down, grabbed the man's neck and lifted him up. Seeing the evil god's cruel face, the man showed a panicked expression. He was very weak just then, but now he desperately cried out in a loud voice, "Help me. This guy wants to kill me." Before he could finish his words, he felt an extremely hot aura coming over from the evil god's hand and blacked out. That 30 beyond way was the unknown fire, which was created by the evil god. The fire was hot and formless. It would not release light even at night. Its power might be very ordinary, but it was extremely difficult to detect and block. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Just as the man called for help, dozens of mounds appeared in the surrounding sand dunes, like something was quickly passing underneath them. Seeing this, the evil god again manically smiled. Then, he lifted the man in his hand and slammed him hard on the ground. Boom. Then, a strange scene occurred. The man in his hand instantly became dehydrated, appearing little more than a husk of his former self. The unknown fire released by the evil god had burned the man's blood, flesh, bones, and brain. His body was now filled with the unknown fire. When the evil god banged him onto the ground, all of the unknown fire in the man's body rushed into the ground and surged under the desert. "Ah, what kind of fire is this? I'm burning." As it turned out, people of the sand country were beneath those dunes. Their cultivation base was not low, and most of them were top-ranked true gods. They had the advantage in numbers, so they not only lured outsiders but also directly attacked them. However, they encountered the evil god this time, so they were out of luck. They crawled out of the ground and rolled around on the dunes. Their bodies were charred by the unknown fire, but no flames were seen. In the blink of an eye, they were killed by the unknown fire. Among the charred corpses, a person managed to survive. The evil god slowly walked toward him. The fastest way to learn about this world was by reading the people's souls. The evil god had had a conflict with a divine citizen before, so he slaughtered all of the residents in the citizens' village by the river. In this manner, he had obtained many memories of this world. However, the status of these divine citizens was too low, and they didn't have much experience. Therefore, the evil god shifted his focus toward true gods as his new targets. Chapter 2587, Sword Dance Palace. The evil god was slightly taken aback by the things he found in the true god's memories. His head is full of crazy nonsense, he thought, his face flushing with anger. He didn't inherently have any morals. Rather, he was fierce and arrogant, like a tyrant. However, there was one thing he cared about the most, the human race. Of course, this was probably because of Zen's influence. In Zen's inner world, there had been the rise of other races, such as the heavenly spirit race. However, with Zen's deliberate suppression and the rise of the human race, the heavenly spirit race had gradually been marginalized. In the end, the evil god had even killed the warriors of the heavenly spirit race for the sake of the human race. In any case, the evil god didn't like other races. As he continued to look through the true god's memories, he found out about the existence of Sand Country. Soon, he learned about how the people from Sand Country were obedient to the man-eating demon flowers and how a great number of people from the country were sacrificed to the man-eating demon flowers every year. How could the human race submit to plants? Humph, once I'm strong enough, I'll get rid of these man-eating flowers one by one. The evil god thought to himself. Then, he found something else in the man's memories that surprised him. The truth of godly way. The other shore realm. When the evil god had left Zen's inner world, he had felt a special aura exuding from Zen that he had never felt before. Back then, he had been so eager to rid himself of Zen's control that he hadn't had the time to ask about the origin of that aura. Now, he finally realized that the consummation of true God realm and the grasp of mixed internal momentum were not the peak of cultivation. If he wanted to become stronger, he would have to reach the other shore realm. As an ambitious warrior, the evil god was thrilled at this realization. He laughed wildly for a long time, as if he had lost his mind. Then, he tossed the man from the sand country to the ground. The man's soul had been shattered into pieces, leaving him no more than a shell of his original self. The evil god slowly walked toward the desert. Although he had found a method to get rid of the sandstorm, he didn't intend to go deep into the desert, because that was where the extremely powerful man-eating demon flowers lurked. Despite his arrogance, the evil god didn't carry any silly notions of being a match for the man-eating demon flowers. He was well aware that if he continued to go toward the depths of the desert, he would undoubtedly be courting death. Fortunately, he had found another way to cross the desert in the true god's memories. As long as he traveled along the middle line of the desert, he would be safe. There was another big port at the end of the desert through which he would be able to go deep into the world. 3 days later, the cyan flying ship that Zen was traveling in arrived at the border of the Gracious Province. The huge boundary wall stood in front of it, like a gigantic piece of green and cyan glass. The space law in this boundary wall is so profound and solid, Zen noted, narrowing his eyes in surprise. Boundary walls existed at the border of every great world and universe, with the exception of the various regions in the Divine Land. Of course, even the Divine Land had an extremely solid space barrier in its outer layer. That space barrier was so thick that even the combined force of Emily and other warriors wouldn't be able to break it. But to Zen's surprise, the boundary wall in front of him now looked even stronger than the space barrier in the outer layer of the Divine Land. He wondered how the warriors from the Swordlight Palace intended to pass through it. But soon, he realized that he had been worrying about nothing. One of the men inside the cyan flying ship lightly jumped into the air and thrust his palm toward the wall. A ripple spread out on the surface of the solid wall, and then a complicated golden Sanskrit word appeared. When Zen saw the golden Sanskrit word, his eyebrows arched up. Although all golden Sanskrit words looked similar, some of them had relatively simple structures while others had extremely complicated ones. The golden Sanskrit word in front of him looked somewhat similar to the golden Sanskrit words in his inner world. Unfortunately, it disappeared before he could commit it to his memory. The man who had thrust his palm toward the wall returned to the flying ship and whispered something to 2 other people. Soon, the air in the cyan flying ship fluctuated and a huge array formed like an umbrella. As the light in the array flew, a huge Sanskrit word similar to the one on the wall appeared. With that, the flying ship advanced. Zen braced himself for impact, but to his surprise, the ship smoothly flew through the thick wall as if it hadn't encountered any obstruction at all. Kenom and the rest of his group raised their heads to look around, their faces filled with curiosity. Although they were aware of the existence of boundary walls, they had never left this big province before in their lives. The array was acknowledged by the boundary wall. Unbelievable, Zen said in amazement. The boundary wall was about 10,000 feet thick, and the flying ship took 5 minutes to completely pass through the wall. When it finally came out from the other side of the wall, a fit of fresh air greeted everyone. The sky ahead of them was a green color, and the whole atmosphere seemed vigorous. This was the 7-star province where the Swordlight Palace was located. Zoom. As the flying ship sped up again, the surrounding scenery became blurry once more. 2 hours later, when the cyan flying ship slowed to a stop, the people from Excellence City rose to their feet and looked down at the scenery below. This is the legendary Swordlight Palace. The lofty sword, that is the lofty sword. A warrior can comprehend the truth of godly way with half the effort if they do it in front of the lofty sword. Seeing the landmark building of the Swordlight Palace, Kenom and his group were very excited. The 7-star province was a huge city built on a mountain. In the center of the city stood a gigantic sword that was 700,000 feet long. Even from such a long distance, Zen could feel the strong truth of godly way exuded by this stone sword. I'm afraid only a wild god would be able to wield such a huge sword. But isn't it said that there are no more wild gods in the source world? Then what is the use of this huge sword? Zen wondered. As the flying ship descended, the lofty sword disappeared from everyone's vision. Finally, the ship landed on a platform in the middle of the mountain city. The pale-faced woman jumped up first and landed on the rails of the ship. She looked at Kenelm and his companions, and then glanced at Zen with a meaningful look in her eyes. Gaelun, lead them to Sword Dance Palace, she said before rushing into the mountain city. Just follow me, said the man named Gaelun Yu. Led by Gaelun Yu, the group walked through the densely packed buildings in the mountain city and finally arrived at Sword Dance Palace. When they arrived at the gate, another 2 men in cyan slowly walked toward them and bowed to Gaelun Yu. These 11 people found a tomb, so Master Laura made an exception to allow them to join Sword Dance Palace, said Gaelun Yu. The 2 men in cyan nodded and led the 11 of them into Sword Dance Palace. Just when they entered the palace with great expectations, a rough laugh sounded. Oh, look, what do we have here? Another dozen dregs in our palace. Never mind, Sword Dance Palace has long become a place for trash. I don't mind taking in more garbage. I hope you can hold on in here long enough. Chapter 2588, Little Devils. Right at the corner of the Sword Dance Palace, there was a man in a cyan robe, who sat quietly. The man was tall and strapping and had sun-kissed dark skin. His face was covered with stubble, which emphasized the cynical look on his face. His clothes were stained and soiled, making him look very messy and unapproachable. As they were walking in the Swordlight Palace, Kenelm and the other people imagined what their future life would be inside the palace. What the strapping man said was like a pot of cold water poured on their faces. Zen was fine, but the other 10 people's faces changed immediately. Sir, how could you say that? A cyan-robed young man questioned, feeling embarrassed. The strapping man got up from the ground and smiled as he slowly walked towards Kenelm and the other people. He stopped in front of them and said, of the 13 cultivation palaces of the Swordlight Palace, the first-class palaces include the Burial Sword Palace, the Demon Sword Palace, and the Broken Sword Palace. The second-class palaces include the Sword Anger Palace, the Sword Legend Palace, and several other palaces. Do you have any idea that of all the cultivation palaces, the Sword Dance Palace is the worst? Now, it only receives people like you who joined the Swordlight Palace in informal ways. You're just wasting your lives if you stay in the Sword Dance Palace. Are you really sure that you want to join this team? Upon hearing the man's statement, Kenelm was the first to lose his temper. At that point, Kenelm felt that his dreams were crushed. He felt like an invisible giant hand suddenly fell from the sky, wiping away his future. Surely, he was not happy with the strapping man's comments. It's said that people who can get to the tomb of your member can become a disciple of the Swordlight Palace. But at this point, it seems that the Swordlight Palace is not going to fulfill this promise. Questioned Kenelm. Smiling faintly, the strapping man replied, there is no reason for the Swordlight Palace to not keep their promises. If you don't want to change your mind and stay in the Sword Dance Palace, then I will certainly welcome you with open arms. What do you mean by that? What are you trying to say? Kenelm asked as he was starting to get angry at the man's audacity. Shrugging his shoulders, the strapping man responded, well, I'm not here to offend you. I'm just telling the truth. The Swordlight Palace had such a big force in the 7-star province and had extremely complicated relationships with others. In fact, many big clans in the 7-star province hoped to send their people to the Swordlight Palace. But due to various reasons, the Swordlight Palace was not able to refuse them. In the beginning, there were only 12 cultivation palaces in the Swordlight Palace. However, as an exception, the Sword Dance Palace was built and had become the 13th cultivation palace. All the people who were not gifted and who were denied from joining the other cultivation palaces were thrown into this one. Moreover, those who entered the Swordlight Palace through the virtue of finding the tombs were also thrown into this palace. Just like what the strapping man had been telling them, it was clear that the Swordlight Palace seemed to be a place for misfits and non-gifted people. Realizing that the place they were so excited to go to was a place for duds, Kenelm and his companions got furious. However, Zen was still unbothered, looking calm as usual. Back when he was still in the Excellent City, Zen had already been suspicious about the rules of the Swordlight Palace. Despite this, he could not just convince Kenelm to believe him and crush his dreams. It was said that every great force had to discover the best disciples, making it a waste of resources to take in ordinary people. This was true in the Divine Land and in the Source World. So, do you still want to join the Sword Dance Palace? Yes, or no? The corner of the strapping man's mouth curled upward in a smirk. Kenelm clenched his fists upon hearing the strapping man's condescending question. Furrowing his brows, he gritted his teeth and answered, yes. The other people from the Excellent City knew that it wouldn't be easy to get this kind of opportunity elsewhere, and if they went back, it would be a huge shame. Me too, count me in. In that case, I'd like to join. The others echoed in succession. All the strapping man felt was pity as he looked at these men's sincere and naive faces. Well, in that case, after you register, head straight to the backyard. I hope that those little devils can shut up for a while. Just when the crowd was about to register following the two cyan-robed men, the strapping man said, "Remember, my name is Ingram Chu. I'm the leader of the Sword Dance Palace. If you meet any trouble, you'd better not ask for my help. Solve it yourself." After his command, Ingram Chu took several steps forward and left the palace without looking back. Everyone was at a loss for words upon hearing Ingram Chu's words. After registering their names on the ledger, they each got a token which served as their official welcome. The Sword Dance Palace wasn't valued, making the entire registration process quick and easy. Afterwards, the two cyan-robed men led everyone into the backyard. "This is your new living space," said one of the cyan-robed men. After showing them around, they left in a hurry and never looked back, as if they were trying to get away from something frightening. The Sword Dance Palace was not that important in the Swordlight Palace. But since it was also a cultivation palace, it was still built according to the standard size of one, making it boast of its very huge backyard. Kenom and his companions all stood there dumbfounded as they could not believe how spacious their new living space was. All of a sudden, a light whistle sounded in the area. After that, 20 to 30 young men clad in cyan slowly walked out from every corner of the backyard. Zen took a close look and observed who these people were. But as soon as he noticed that they bore unfriendly expressions on their faces, he narrowed his eyes in suspicion. "Ha ha, it has only been half a month, and someone recklessly joined the Sword Dance Palace. It seems that most of you are definitely not from the 7-star city," said a long-haired young man who led the crowd, smiling in contempt. "People from the 7-star city are not that stupid. Our Sword Dance Palace is notorious in that city, and no one dares to come here especially when they are threatened with death," another silver-haired young man said, and also had a strange smile on his face. Standing in front of these men, Kenom seemed to be gauging the matter as he tried to understand what the two men meant. As he stared at the long-haired young man, he could not help but ask in a trembling voice, What do you mean by that?" "Nothing. It's just that there are rules in the Sword Dance Palace that need to be followed. The first step in joining us is for you to know them." As the long-haired young man was trying to explain, Zen turned around and walked outside. "Wait, Zen, where are you going?" Kenom asked Zen in a worried tone. Although Kenom appeared to be the backbone of the group, he would turn to Zen in times of trouble. However, Zen ignored Kenom and trotted all the way, catching up with the two cyan-robed men who brought them to the living area. The two men turned around and saw Zen chasing after them. Confused, one of the men asked him, "What seems to be the problem?" Zen gave them a smile and asked, "I just want to ask you. What are the rules in the Sword Dance Palace? Would there be any punishment for any disciples who fight?" Taken aback by Zen's question, the two cyan-robed men exchanged glances. Of course, they knew what was going on in the backyard, and that was why they left hurriedly. Although those little devils were not extraordinary when it came to talent, they had a very strong background and were also responsible for the Sword Dance Palace's bad reputation. "Well, there are not many rules in the Sword Dance Palace. Disciples can spar with each other, but you can't kill people," one of the two replied. Almost all the disciples who joined the Sword Dance Palace had to be challenged by that group of little devils, like some kind of initiation. Only a small number of people were able to make it through, and most of them chose to leave the Sword Dance Palace after staying for less than one day. In fact, more than 100 people had chosen to quit this year. "I see. Thank you for answering my question." Zen nodded as he returned to the backyard. Shaking their heads slightly, the two cyan-robed men were concerned about him and his friends. This person doesn't believe that those little devils are difficult to deal with. If he leaves now, then he would surely avoid injury. I mean, those guys are really. Apparently, the two of them had suffered a lot from those troublemakers. Chapter 2589, Counterattack. The disciples of the Sword Dance Palace had mediocre talents. However, they had connections with the higher-ups of the 7-star city and the Swordlight Palace. Each of them had a different sort of link with them. They were either direct descendants of some elders, or members of the large clans in the 7-star city. Due to these links, they were spoiled rotten by their families. When they collectively joined the Sword Dance Palace, they became well acquainted with one another and formed an alliance. This proved cancerous for the Swordlight Palace. If anyone dared provoke them, they would find themselves facing severe consequences. After learning the rules of the palace, he made up his mind on what he had to do and headed back to the backyard through the same path he came. As he made his way back, an explosive sound coming from the backyard made him stop in his tracks. Shortly after, he witnessed a strong wave of heat spread across the walls. Before he could process anything, he heard disturbing outcries coming from the direction of the sound. He quickened his steps to see what was going on. Meanwhile, Kenom and the others lay splayed out on the ground in the backyard. Each of their bodies was charred and badly injured from the impact. In a state of shock, one of the injured warriors became furious and shouted, "We are now fellow disciples of the Sword Dance Palace after we joined. How could you treat us like this?" The man who spoke out was a respectable authority figure at the Excellent City. He had been recommended by the city lord to become a disciple at the Sword Dance Palace. His arrogant nature did not stand for this behavior towards him. How could he stomach being treated with such disgrace by the members of the Sword Dance Palace? "Who are our fellow disciples? Do you think you are even qualified?" An authoritative voice came from the group. A silver-haired young man pushed aside the disciples and walked over to the protesting man. The approaching figure had handsome features, and was the youngest of the group. Overflowing with arrogance, he took 2 steps towards this man before stomping him down on the ground. He looked at the man and scowled. "Whether you can join the Sword Dance Palace or not is not the decision of the higher-ups or Ingram. It is us, who make the final call. Understood?" The man gritted his teeth and glared at him. "What should we do to join the Sword Dance Palace?" The silver-haired boy shrugged his shoulders and chuckled in amusement. "Well, you have to pass 5 tests. What you've experienced just now was the first test, the burning test." "What's the second test?" the man asked, looking displeased. "The second test is the statue test," the silver-haired boy replied as traces of ice particles began to spread from his fingertips. "I'll freeze you into statues and place you in our backyard for 10 to 15 days. If you are willing to accept the test, I'll do it right now. Are you ready?" As the boy continued talking disrespectfully, Kenom could feel himself fuming with anger. He dug his nails into the ground and gritted his teeth. The humiliation from the disciples kept testing his patience. Everything was getting on his nerves. Normally, he was gentle and kind. But the disciples had driven him off the edge. He felt a strong killing intent generate inside of him, and he scowled, "I'll fight you to death. Right here, right now." With a cold look on his face, he got up and knocked his fists together. Swoosh! As his internal momentum burst out from his body, Kenom charged towards the silver-haired boy like a sharp knife. Kenom was a consummate true god, and his power was not to be underestimated. He dashed towards the silver-haired boy and unleashed all his energy. Because of the short distance between him and the boy, the attack would prove more effective. However, just as he made his move, a disciple stepped up and reached for a silver bead. The silver bead in his hand shone a flash of silver light on its surface. Suddenly, Kenom's internal momentum dissipated into thin air, rendering him powerless. Before he could get to the silver-haired boy, the boy flipped in the air and gave Kenom a hard kick on his chest. He felt his chest cave in as he was knocked back for several dozen feet from the impact. His back knocked against a rock as he fell with a loud thud and passed out from the pain. "You wanted to fight me to death. You mongrel," the silver-haired boy scoffed while fixing his hair. These disciples were not strong in terms of physical strength, they were not the most gifted in talents either. But, they were each from a noble clan. Each of them possessed powerful treasures handed down to them from their families. All of them were given latent thurges for protection. Ordinary consummate true gods like Kenom were no match for them. The faces of the others from the Excellent City turned pale when they saw what Kenom had gone through for protesting against them. They did not wish to suffer the same fate. Before coming here, they had heard the Sword Dance Palace was not a serious place for cultivation. The only thing that attracted them was the fact that it was under the jurisdiction of the Swordlight Palace. Despite all the warnings, they had never imagined to encounter such a cruel group in the Sword Dance Palace. They recalled Ingram telling them about the little devils of the Sword Dance Palace. Little had they known that he was referring to the disciples in front of them. "Anyone who wants to pass 5 tests will line up before me. The rockery in this backyard is too monotonous for my taste. Although you are all terrible looking, you will be good decorations for this place. If you are unwilling to do that, you can just quit joining the Sword Dance Palace and go back home," the silver-haired boy said with a chuckle. The other disciples behind him burst into laughter. Every time there was a newcomer, they would toy around with them. It became a ritual for them. "We'd better give up joining the Sword Dance Palace. These guys are making things difficult for us on purpose. Even if we agree with their requirements, they won't let us be in peace in the future." The people from the Excellent City discussed among themselves. They had realized these disciples did not plan on making things easy for them. If they bowed to their wishes now, they would suffer forever. They would not stop until they had driven them all away. You're dang right, the silver-haired boy said nonchalantly. The resources in the Sword Dance Palace are limited. You trashy guys expect us to share them with you. It's wishful thinking. You'd better get out of here as soon as possible. Before the boy could finish what he had to say, Zen walked in from the corridor. He ran a quick gaze around the backyard and found Kenelm unconscious on the rockery. The group watched as Zen made his way towards Kenelm in silence. He helped Kenelm down and wrapped his arm around his shoulder. A green light flickered in Zen's hand as he pressed it against Kenelm's frail body. It was the internal momentum of the life-godly way. Suddenly, the light got absorbed into Kenelm's wounds and began healing them. He slowly recovered and opened his eyes. Kenelm groaned slightly and blinked several times to make out Zen's face. Zen, where did you go? Kenelm asked as he regained his full consciousness. To know the rules, of course, Zen replied with a gentle smile. To know the rules? What do you mean? Kenelm asked again in confusion. Zen glanced towards the disciples and loosened his grip on Kenelm. He slowly stood up and said indifferently, I heard that all disciples can fight freely as long as no one dies in combat. I didn't expect the rules of the Swordlight Palace to be so loose. When the silver-haired boy heard this, he smirked mockingly. Why do you trouble yourself to learn these rules? Do you want to fight with us? In the Seven-Star City, they were always the ones who would bully others. No one dared to stand up against them. Zen balled his hands into fists and tightened his jaw. He glared at the silver-haired boy and smiled. That's exactly what I've been thinking about. The moment these words left his mouth, Zen dashed towards the silver-haired boy like an arrow released from its bow. The ground beneath his feet turned to powder as he stomped on it with massive strength. The boy froze in place, unable to react. Baffled from Zen's sudden advancement, the boy saw a vicious flash of light sparkled in front of his eyes. Before he could say anything, Zen's fist made contact with his face and sent him flying. Bang! With a grating sound, the silver-haired boy rolled over in the air and crashed into the wall of the backyard. The impact of his back hitting the wall so hard cracked it into pieces. Zen had only used 1/10 of his whole strength in this punch. Had he used up his full potential, he could have cracked the boy's skull open. The silver-haired boy's handsome face had been deformed from the blow as he lay motionless on the ground. Everyone who witnessed the scene gasped in utter bewilderment. After all, the young boy's father was the head of the noble Yubai clan. Chapter 2590, The Bitter Lesson. The air in the backyard seemed to solidify. These rich, evil disciples hadn't expected Zen to make such a move. How dare you attack Jago? One of them shouted. Zen turned to smile at the young man. I'm a fair person, he said with a shrug. Fair about what? The young man barked, puzzled at Zen's words. I don't discriminate between people. I'll punch everyone, Zen said, floating like a ghost towards the other man and slapping him in the face. The smack was so heavy it sent the young man spinning several times and flying through the air before he fell to the ground. The diabolical disciples finally realized that Zen wasn't to be taken lightly. The soul-controlling bead. One of the disciples pulled out the silver bead again. With a flash of light, the bead sealed the internal momentum in Zen's body. But Zen hadn't used any internal momentum yet. He could move at a high speed using purely his physical strength. The rich, evil disciples all had a high cultivation base, but their actual combat ability was close to zero. They might be good at playing tricks and using their magic weapons to suppress consummate true gods. But it was impossible for them to defeat Zen, who was experienced in battles. The soul-controlling bead blocked his elixir field, causing Zen to stop and reconsider. And then, in the blink of an eye, he rushed over to the young man. He stretched out both his hands like lightning and grabbed the bead with one hand while twisting the young man's arm with the other, shattering it into pieces. Zen sighed as he saw the horror in the man's eyes. These people had their cultivation bases and magic weapons, and yet they were so weak that they could hardly cope with anything. Trap him, someone shouted, but it was not easy to trap Zen. Zen activated the truth of cultivation nature, and moved extremely fast. There was no way for his foes to catch up with him. As they chased him, houses, rockeries, and walls in the backyard came crashing down. Even the ground shook from time to time. The two men guarding the gate of Sword Dance Palace couldn't help but sigh as they heard the noise. What a din! I think they've destroyed the backyard again. They do this all the time. Every time I see the newcomers, I feel sorry for them. I try my best to persuade them not to join the Swordlight Palace, but they never appreciate my well-intended advice. Now, I don't care anymore. Sometimes people only learn after they begin regretting it. The ground continued to tremble as they spoke, and the sound in the backyard grew louder by the minute. A moment later, a violent explosion sounded from the backyard. Boom! A dreadful aura spread out, causing the sword dance palace to tremble. The two disciples looked at each other, shocked. If they chose to do nothing, they were afraid that the disciples within would tear down the entire sword dance palace. "Let's go inside and see what's happening," one of them suggested. The disciples were hellraisers, but they had never made so much noise in the past. This time seemed different. The two men in cyan went straight to the backyard. One of them then walked up to the mountain beside the sword dance palace. Ingram Chu lay in a pavilion in the mountain, drinking. Ever since he was appointed as the head of the sword dance palace, Ingram Chu had been in low spirits most of the time. That was probably why the sword dance palace had been reduced to this state. The man in cyan flew into the pavilion. "Master, something bad has happened." "What is it? Do those new disciples want to leave because they can't stand it anymore?" Ingram Chu asked, his words slurring. He had anticipated that the newcomers wouldn't be able to stay for long in the sword dance palace, which was why his tone was calm and composed. The disciple shook his head. "No, Master, the disciples from the Yubai clan and the Chu clan have all been knocked out. Fagan has activated a latent theurgy, and most of the sword dance palace has been destroyed." "What?" Ingram Chu yelled, his expression changing to one of shock. The pot of alcohol fell from his grip and he disappeared into thin air. He then appeared in the sword dance palace. Just as the disciple in cyan had reported to him, the entire backyard of the palace was now in ruins. Houses, pavilions, and courtyards were destroyed. In the backyard, the newcomers stood safe and sound, while the rich disciples of the sword dance palace looked to be writhing in pain. Even the least injured of them had broken arms and legs. Dying people lay on the ground, motionless, half their bodies smashed. The only one among them that was still upright was the long-haired young man. A golden eggshell was wrapped around the long-haired young man's body. This golden eggshell was a latent theurgy that the master of the Chu clan had given him. It could be activated for protection when he was in danger. It was the golden eggshell that had prevented him from being beaten unconscious by Zen. "You are so dead. You have not only offended the Chu clan, but also the Yubai clan. You won't get away with this," threatened the young man with the long hair, gritting his teeth as he hid behind the golden eggshell. Zen had heard too many threats in his life, and this young man's words were hardly a dent on the armor he had brought up around himself. "Really?" Zen said, his faint smile amused. He spread out his arms and flew up into the air, drawing a perfect arc as he went. This time, Zen had used 80% of his strength. The golden eggshell shook under the violent attack, but it still stood strong. "Go on. You think you can break my grandfather's latent theurgy? You are daydreaming." The long-haired young man roared. Zen ignored the young man's sarcasm and poured his violent power on the golden eggshell through his punches. A crack eventually appeared in the upper part of the eggshell. The young man panicked, horrified. He knew very well that he was no match for Zen. Once the golden eggshell broke, he would probably end up like the others. Zen took a deep breath and extracted his strength source so that it gathered in his fist. He was about to crush the golden eggshell once and for all when a palm emerged from one side and blocked his movements. Zen's fist hit the palm. All of a sudden, all the power of his fist vanished. "That's enough," said Ingram Chu, coming to stand before Zen. He looked cautiously at the young man in front of him. Strength aside, he was surprised to see that Zen even had the courage to challenge the troublesome disciples of the Sword Dance Palace. After all, Zen had just joined the Sword Dance Palace. Chapter 2591, The Destroyed Sword Dance Palace. The young man with long hair looked even more ferocious when he saw that Ingram had arrived and stopped Zen. He screamed, "Ingram, crush him, kill him, just like the way you would kill an ant." The youth with wild long hair was Fagan Chu. Even though he was not a very powerful martial artist, he held an honorary position in the Chu clan hierarchy. That was why he had the audacity to command Ingram to kill Zen. Witnessing the scene, Kenelm and his friends started to get jittery. If the leader of the palace took the matter seriously, Zen would definitely land himself in big trouble. At the same time, they could not ignore the fact that Zen caused such a ruckus because he stood up for them. Kenelm cupped his hands towards Ingram and said, "Master Ingram, Zen just stood up for us. Hence, we all are willing to take up any punishment bestowed on us. Please leave Zen out of this." Ignoring their remarks, Ingram continued to stare at Zen, as he said, "You just joined the Sword Dance Palace. But in just a short span of time, you managed to injure so many disciples. You are bold." Zen said calmly, I am well versed with the rules of the Sword Dance Palace, all thanks to that friend, standing over there. As he spoke, he pointed to the man in cyan not far away. The man looked stunned when everyone's attention was drawn on him. He was afraid that he would be blamed, so he quickly feigned ignorance and said, Me. I merely informed him that warriors could spar with each other, as long as they don't cause any death. That's the rule we always follow in the Sword Dance Palace. The man didn't expect that Zen would create such a scene and put him in the spotlight. Zen smiled at Ingram and said, That's a fine rule. Truth be told, no one died today. Even if the disciples of the Sword Dance Palace were seriously injured, they will recover instantly with some treatment. Most of those disciples were consummate true gods. Zen had made conscious efforts to avoid making fatal impact on their bellies and souls. He knew they would regain their strength, no matter how seriously they were wounded, especially when they were in such a powerful place like the Swordlight Palace. Ingram stared at Zen for a while. Suddenly his expression cleared, as a thought crept up. Zen was sent here by Laura. She was in charge of the 13 cultivation palaces under the Swordlight Palace. She should be well aware about the chaos of the Sword Dance Palace. Was there any motive behind her sending this man here? The young men from the rich clans were unruly and arrogant. They always refused to pay heed to others. This guy gave them a tough lesson to learn, though it was at the cost of their blood. In that case, it was actually a commendable deed. Ingram, why are you standing there as if you have lost both your ears? Didn't you hear me? I asked you to kill him. Fagin furiously said with gritted teeth. Ingram calmly turned his head and said with a smile, This new disciple, who goes by the name Zen, hasn't violated any rule of our Sword Dance Palace. Then why should I kill him? How dare you defy my command? It is my prerogative to impart any rule in the Sword Dance Palace. You just tell me whether you have the guts to kill him or not. Fagin roared louder, as the others cringed nervously. A ruthless aura flashed across Ingram's eyes when he heard Fagin's rude words. He patted gently on the golden egg shell at the surface of Fagin's body. The golden egg shell was anyways on the verge of breaking. That was why, within Ram's mere pat, the shell broke into pieces. Then Ingram patted him on the shoulder and said with a smile, You and I are both from the Chu clan. Back then, I was 100 times more bossy and ruthless than what you are right now. But there was one thing that differentiated both of us. No matter how strong my opponent was, I would always fight back on my own. You must also do the same. Put in your own efforts to save your face. Then he strode out without even glancing back. You, Ingram. I will ensure your behavior is reported to my father. You proved that you are a loser of our Chu clan. You even didn't help your clansmen. You were entrusted to this small palace for the sake of that jerk. You deserve it. Fagin was furious to see Ingram ignoring him. He continued to curse as he saw Ingram's retreating figure. Just as he was crazily cursing, Ingram suddenly turned back. His original benign and calm face instantly had a murderous look. His eyes were blazing with anger. Back off. Zen's heart trembled at Ingram's voice, and he flew backwards. An invisible force rolled out from both sides of his arms, sending Kenelm and his friends over 1,000 feet away. As soon as Zen retreated, Ingram suddenly shouted, Get out! Boom! The earth trembled and the mountains shook. Ingram's roar was heard by half of the divine citizens of the Seven-Star City. Half of the Sword Dance Palace was already destroyed before, and now the other half was also flattened by the spreading shock waves. Even Zen had managed to drag Kenelm and his friends over 1,000 feet away. They were still bleeding from their noses, mouths and ears, because of the terrifying shock waves. As for Fagin, he looked as if he had been ripped apart from the bones. He was covered in blood and every inch of his body was badly wounded. In fact, Ingram had controlled his energy. If it weren't for the fact that they were both from the Chu clan, Ingram would have pulverized him into ashes with his roar. The two men in cyan clothes were too frightened to even move. They just slumped to the ground in shock. They had never seen the leader of the palace get so angry before. It took the whole of 3 days to rebuild the destroyed Sword Dance Palace. The young disciples from the rich clans in the Seven-Star City who were wounded by Zen were sent back to their respective clans for treatment. Although their injuries looked frightening, they were not fatal. Among them, Fagin was the one who was most seriously injured. Even his soul had been greatly damaged. However, this time, Zen was not the one who caused his injuries but Ingram. The newcomers of the Sword Dance Palace had been assigned places for their rest and stay. However, Kenelm and his friends continued to feel uneasy. After all, they had offended everyone since the time they landed here. What if they changed their mind and prosecuted them? But all his worries were put to rest. In the middle of the night, Zen leaned on the balcony of his residence, looking up at the starry sky. The night in the seven-star province was extremely beautiful. Above his head, there were stars as big as a fist, shining with brilliance. These stars were moving extremely fast, and they circled the sky once in just a few seconds. No one knew what kind of mystery was there in the sky of the source world that it could produce such a miraculous scene. What am I doing here? Zen wondered out loud. Zen had merely agreed to the woman's invitation because of a whimsical idea of no. 9527. He didn't see any point in joining this perdition place. The sword dance palace was rubbish and it was a complete waste of time for him to stay here. There isn't any special reason. Joining a human force is always safer than you roaming around aimlessly, number 9527 replied calmly. Is this what you had planned for me? Zen complained. Number 9527 hardly regretted its decision. It inquired, what is the problem? What can you do with your current strength? You are still insignificant in any place of source world. Other than making yourself stronger, is there any other way? At least you could have selected a decent place and not this rubbish heap. This sword-light palace is just nonsense. Zen complained. The ancient scorpion race in the source world owes my master a favor. If you go to the ancient scorpion race, I can help you get a good position, but would you be fine to live among those stinging scorpions? Number 9527 asked. Zen pursed his lips and didn't say anything. There were all sorts of strange races in the source world, and most of them weren't even humans. Besides, Zen was not capable of crossing a province. Since he had joined the Swordlight Palace, the only option he had was to stay and face the challenges. Chapter 2592, Killing Two Birds with One Stone. Fagin was the last to wake up. When he finally pried his eyes open, he discovered he was soaking in a large tank filled with a blood-red liquid. The liquid was the sap of an insect containing the soul force capable of effectively healing damage to the soul. Fagin awoke enraged. He was about to burst out of the large tank and on his way when a woman flew from behind, forcing him back into the tank. Master Fagin, you really are injured quite badly. You'd better remain in the tank a while longer to fully heal your wounds, the woman said very patiently, a sweet smile on her face. I wish to see my father. How dare Ingram hurt me? I'll get my father to kick him from our clan. Fagin exclaimed with great displeasure and resentment. On hearing this, the woman shook her head and said calmly, I've already spoken with your father. What did he say? Fagin asked, his eyes lighting up. He said you deserved it, the woman said helplessly. Although the Board of Elders has demoted Ingram, he is still a hero of the Chu clan. The Chu clan is to blame for what happened that year. Even the elders dare not mention this in front of Ingram, but you did. You're quite lucky he didn't kill you in a fit of anger. Fagin frowned and realized that he really was too rash. At the least he shouldn't have targeted Ingram. His heart still fluttered with fear when he thought of that dreadful scene. Humph, I'll put this matter aside right now. Astrid, accompany me to kill that brat from the Sword Dance Palace. Fagin yelled in demand. Astrid was an adopted daughter of the Chu clan and a great talent no doubt. Although she didn't join any palace, she had reached the other shore realm under the training of the Chu clan. For her, killing a consummate true god would be child's play. Astrid and Fagin had a good relationship. Because of this, Fagin thought she would accept his offer without hesitation. Much to his surprise, Astrid shook her head solemnly and said, Master Fagin, I can't. Why is that? Fagin asked, raising his voice. Astrid was always very obedient to him. Your father will not allow it, Astrid answered in a feeble tone. Fine, then I'll find someone else. There were many strong warriors in the Chu clan, so he, as the young master, would have no trouble in finding someone else to join him. I'm afraid you can't do that either, Astrid said. Master Laura has sent a message. She's asked you to work this out in the cultivation palace by yourselves, and your father has agreed. How could this be possible? Fagin frowned. So I cannot do anything to Zen. I have an idea, Astrid said with a smile. What is it? Asked Fagin intrigued. You can seek revenge using your own strength, Astrid said, blinking her eyes. With these words, Fagin fell silent. Zen had mastered the truth of cultivation nature. He moved swiftly like a ghost and boasted infinite power. How could he take revenge all on his own? He simply stood no chance. Half a day later, Fagin found Jago Yubai. Once their wounds had healed, those over 30 playboys didn't go to the Sword Dance Palace, but instead gathered in a tavern in the Seven-Star City. What? You're kidding. You've come across the same thing. Fagin was a little stunned. Jago smoothed the fringe on his forehead and smacked his lips. I kid you not. I can't order any guard in my clan. They act as if the matter does not concern them. And who on earth is Zen Luo? Why are our clans so afraid of him? He is just an outsider. I've never heard of the excellent city. There is no truly powerful force in the gracious province, exclaimed Fagin indifferently. Yet they do not dare to make a move against him, said Jago in confusion. After thinking a while, Fagin said with a flash in his eyes, let's go to find Chadwick. Zen will be no match for us if we surround him with Chadwick's help. Chadwick. Jago's face changed slightly at this suggestion. There were many playboys in the sword dance palace, but there were still some talents among them. Chadwick certainly was one of them. Most of the time, however, he could not be found in the sword dance palace. More importantly, he was a greedy man. It would cost them a lot of divine crystals to acquire his help. Still, they were determined to get even with Zen and humiliate him as they were humiliated. They then stormed out of the tavern. The other diners knew who they were, so they dared not get in their way. On the top floor of the tavern, Laura quietly watched with a pale face what transpired downstairs. Beside Laura sat a gray-haired old man. He was Fagin's grandfather and one of the 3 elders in the Swordlight Palace. Is this really the right way to go about this? Asked the old man with knitted brows. Laura smiled and said, they have to learn this lesson. Is Zen really as great a talent as you have suggested? Has he really merged over 1,000 godly ways at such a young age? The old man asked, both excited and concerned. Laura nodded and said, his internal momentum is too complicated. I can't tell how many godly ways there are. It may be 1,000 or 2,000. The old man's eyes were filled with astonishment. It's impossible for such a person as this to come from the barren gracious province. He is not a local there. He came through the Wild Goose Pass. But I'm unsure where his hometown is, Laura admitted in a low voice, shaking her head. She was in charge of the 13 cultivation palaces of the Swordlight Palace. Given Zen's talent, he should be able to join the Burial Sword Palace or the Demon Sword Palace, but she had made a decision to leave Zen in the Sword Dance Palace temporarily. On the one hand, she could test Zen, and on the other hand, she could teach the playboys in the 7-star city with the help of Zen. It could be seen as killing 2 birds with 1 stone. But she didn't expect that Zen would go that far. On the first day, he had made the Sword Dance Palace a mess, and even made Ingram furious. That day, she had also been observing Zen secretly. If the situation got out of control, she would take action to stop it. However, Zen knew what he was doing. She was quite pleased that he hadn't killed anyone. She had then informed all the clans of the 7-star city in advance that no one was allowed to make a move against Zen. She wondered how Fagin and other playboys would fight back with this in mind. The Sword Dance Palace was quiet for a few days. The 11 new members lived in the spacious backyard. Some goods were distributed in the palace, such as the cyan clothes and the cyan swords of the Swordlight Palace. Of course, the cyan swords that Kenelm and the others received were different from the Stinger Guards, but they were enough to surprise and excite them. In addition, the Swordlight Palace had given them the most important thing, the translation of the truth of eternal sword intent, from which they could learn the truth of godly way. Chapter 2593, Cultivating 2 Truths of Godly Ways. Truths of godly ways were common in the source world. It was difficult to decipher the meaning of the Sanskrit words that had been used to record the truths of godly ways. However, once deciphered, the record would be extremely easy to replicate. Many versions of the translations of the truths of godly ways existed. In addition to the versions of human language, the texts had also been transcribed in the languages of other races. The translations of the truths of godly ways were easy to obtain, but few people could truly comprehend them. There appears to be no difference between this translation and what we usually see, said Kenelm as he thumbed through the translation, his face plainly showing his disappointment. After staying at the Sword Dance Palace for so many days, the group had been looking forward to what they would get. To their disappointment, it was nothing out of the ordinary. The truth of godly way is translated as a whole. You cannot add or subtract one word, as it is strictly prohibited. It only makes sense that there is no difference between this translation and what we usually see. The most important resource belonging to the Swordlight Palace is the lofty sword. If we could observe it from a short distance, the knowledge could be extremely helpful to us, another person opined. You're right, Hyde. We joined the Swordlight Palace not because of this translation, Kenelm agreed. Then he looked over at Zen. Zen leafed through the cyan book in his hand and recited the contents of a page under his breath, as if he couldn't wait to cultivate the truth of eternal sword intent recorded in the book. Zen, do you want to cultivate the truth of eternal sword intent? Haven't you already cultivated the truth of cultivation nature? Asked Kenelm. A strange look passed across his face. Zen's train of thought was interrupted by Kenom's question. He smiled faintly and said, "Can't I? Is it not possible to cultivate two truths of godly ways?" "It's not like that. What I meant was, since you have already practiced the truth of cultivation nature, it would be too late and time-consuming for you to cultivate the truth of eternal sword intent too. Although the masters in the Sword Light Palace focus on the truth of eternal sword intent, they also have the cultivation methods that correspond to the other truths of godly ways." Zen nodded and replied, "If cultivating one more truth of godly way wouldn't pose any problems, then I don't intend to waste such an opportunity." While speaking, Zen sighed inwardly. Complete translations of the truths of godly ways were rare in the divine land. Even a holy being would be hard-pressed to find one. By contrast, these translations were popular goods of dependable quality in the source world. The disparity was too great. The gap could be attributed to people in the divine land failing to impart and inherit the knowledge of the Nine Li race before the race was destroyed. Zen's mother had retained a slight bias against the aboriginals of the divine land, so she was naturally unwilling to teach them the truth of godly way that she had cultivated. It is said that if one cultivates another truth of godly way, their body can accommodate one more other sure token. Zen, I believe you can cultivate two truths of godly ways. Hyde, a consummate true god, complimented Zen. These 10 people had witnessed with their own eyes how Zen easily beat more than 30 disciples from the Sword Dance Palace. In their eyes, Zen was so powerful that they had subconsciously regarded him as their leader. I'm flattered, Hyde. The truth of eternal sword intent is very complicated. I fear that it will take me a long time to. Before Zen could finish his words, an extremely sharp aura streamed through the walls of the Sword Dance Palace and headed straight to the backyard. Like a substance that could pierce through people's hearts, the tip of the aura induced shivers in their group of 10 people, including Kenom. Their eyes betrayed their fear. Zen's eyebrows twitched as he felt the aura. He recognized it as an aura produced by the truth of eternal sword intent. It was strong, long-lasting, and sharp. Accompanied by the sound of messy footsteps, more than 30 people rushed in through the backyard gate. They were the disciples whom Zen had beaten. They come at last, Zen thought to himself. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly. He knew exactly what these disciples were like. If they didn't yield, they would do everything to mobilize all of their resources to fight back. They had never suffered this kind of grievance before. After rushing into the backyard, all of them stared at Zen viciously. If looks could kill, Zen would have died for hundreds of thousands of times already. Chadwick, it's him, Fagin said coldly. Let's get rid of him together, said Jago, stroking his silver forelock. At this moment, a strange voice resounded from the crowd. He has only recently entered the Sea of Truth, hasn't he? He is a nobody who has barely passed the first line, and yet you ask me here to fight against him together. Are you looking down on me? Then, a man stepped out of the crowd. He was 8 feet tall, thin as a bamboo pole and just as frail looking, but he exuded a strong aura. When he exerted all his strength, it seemed as if he himself was a sharp sword. It was Chadwick, a talent from the Chu clan whom they had paid a lot of money to invite. There was no obstacle in the backyard, and the aura released by Chadwick was even sharper. When Kenom and the other 9 people faced it, they felt increasingly uncomfortable, and their faces were all as pale as a ghost. However, Kenom plucked up his courage and stammered, "This is the Sword Dance Palace. According to the rules, only the disciples in the Sword Dance Palace can fight with each other. As a member of another palace, I'm afraid it will be against the rules for you to fight against us." Worrying about the retaliation from those disciples, Kenom had learned the rules of the Sword Dance Palace in recent days. Ha ha ha, the disciples burst into laughter upon hearing his words. Look at these losers. They just arrived here a few days ago, but now they are explaining the rules to us. Fagin said with a sneer. They are so funny. They don't know that Ingram pays no attention to the Sword Dance Palace at all. The rules of the Sword Dance Palace are set by us. Jago also laughed hysterically. Among the 13 palaces under the jurisdiction of the Sword Light Palace, the Sword Dance Palace had the most lax of rules. Disciples in other palaces were not allowed to battle at will. These disciples had set up the rules of the Sword Dance Palace in order to drive away the disciples who joined the palace after them. Kenom and his friends looked at each other, deeply concerned. Zen, however, was not the least bit worried about it. Zen tilted his head and stared at Fagin. Even if the rules were laid down by you, they are still the rules of the Sword Dance Palace. Isn't it against them to have an outsider fight for you? It's a pity. I'm a disciple of the Sword Dance Palace, Chadwick said flatly. Fagin also mocked. Only losers like you will follow the rules and try to avoid getting caught. It's a pity, isn't it? Zen shook his head without any expression. If he were not a disciple of the Sword Dance Palace, I would be breaking the rules. Now that he has identified himself as a disciple of the Sword Dance Palace, then I won't be breaking the rules. I'm relieved to hear that. What do you mean? Chadwick's eyes slightly narrowed. With a bang, the ground that had just been repaired was suddenly ripped wide open into a massive hole. Zen transformed into a remnant figure, cutting a path at an unimaginable speed and coming straight toward Chadwick. With his cultivation base, Chadwick could undisputedly rank first in the Sword Dance Palace. However, like the other disciples in the Sword Dance Palace, he had little experience in actual combat. He had never thought that Zen would suddenly launch an attack. When Zen reached him, Chadwick had already pulled his cyan sword out of its sheath. Then, a crisp sound rang, and before anyone could blink, his one arm was swinging down uselessly to his side. Chapter 2594, Observing the Lofty Sword. Faced with Zen's sudden attack, Chadwick flew into a rage. The Sword Light Palace was actually a sect that attached great importance to battle rules. In other words, they despised a sneak attack more than anything else. Even if the two were engaged in a fair competition, Zen was almost sure that he'd defeat his opponent without too much struggle. However, he didn't want to waste both his time and energy by getting into a fight with this man. It just wasn't worth it. What Zen wanted, in fact, was only to solve the problem as quickly as possible. Followed by Chadwick's shocked and confused expression, Zen's palm was already pushing against his opponent's jaw. In a split second, Chadwick heard a loud roar coming from his very own head. White light flashed before his entire body went limp and unconscious. Zen cast a last glance at the unconscious Chadwick before turning to look at Fagin and Jago. He smiled faintly and asked, "Do you still want to fight me?" As Fagin and Jago watched the scene played out before their very eyes, their faces turned ghastly pale. If it were anyone else, how would they dare fight back? Despite everything, they had come here aggressively. How could they retreat now, after having come so far? That would be nothing less than humiliating. The two of them couldn't help but feel completely embarrassed. "Fight!" Fagin shouted loudly. They were well prepared for today's fight. Maybe they still had a chance, Fagin figured. It took no more than 5 minutes before 30 or so disciples were lying down on the ground once more. This time, Zen had restrained himself a lot. He simply knocked them out one by one, causing very little damage to the Sword Dance Palace. In a private Sword Dance Palace room, Ingram's lips spread into a smile as he observed the ongoing scene. He couldn't help but admire Laura's foresight. After traveling to the Gracious Province, Laura not only brought the former leader's personal effects back with her, but she also brought back a genius, Zen. Ingram believed that Zen would still be a top disciple if he were in the Burial Sword Palace. Perhaps this time, the Sword Dance Palace would be capable of flourishing thanks to Zen. Previously, Ingram was dissatisfied with being relegated to the Sword Dance Palace. But now, he was looking forward to the palace's future. It wasn't until they were taught 2 lessons in a row that Fagin, Jago and their followers finally understood what was happening to them. The clans that they relied on no longer provided them with assistance. Even Chadwick, the strongest one among them, wasn't a near match for Zen. There were no resources on their side that could help them fight back. After understanding the problem clearly, they finally chose to accept their destiny, ultimately deciding to get along with Zen and his followers. "Zen, the best room of the Sword Dance Palace has been kept for you. As for the others, you may choose your rooms according to the rules." On his behalf, Zen wasn't very comfortable. Why the sudden change in their attitudes? That's good. At least this way, they won't be thinking of revenge at all times, he thought to himself. Although the disciples were all arrogant and unruly, once they accepted Zen and his followers, it was much easier for them to get along. They were rich and loyal to their friends. In the past few days, they had invited Kenelm and Zen to travel around the 7-star city. Through this, Zen had learned a little history about the Swordlight Palace. That said though, these disciples didn't cherish the cultivation resources at all. Disciples like Fagin and Jago had talents that weren't too bad. They were born into big clans, and their status was much higher than that of the others. Under the care of their families, it was naturally difficult for them to have great ambitions regarding the cultivation. In contrast, people such as Kenelm worked much harder than the rest. Most of their time was spent reading the Truth of Eternal Sword Intent translation. Zen was only a disciple of the Sword Dance Palace, and there was no need or reason for him to teach these guys to concentrate on cultivation. However, it remained strange that these disciples indeed changed a lot, notably so after he defeated them twice with his irresistible strength. At the very least, they hoped to become stronger, and therefore, their interest in cultivation had no choice but to develop as well. Fagin and the others had asked Zen a few questions, such as why he was much stronger than them even though they were at the same cultivation level. Their questions were rooted in reason and curiosity. Zen would certainly offer the truth to the questions that could be answered, but there were certain questions that involved his own secrets, and in such cases, he held his silence. Not even a month later, the Sword Light Palace organized their very first sword observing activity. Those observing the sword would be the disciples of all 13 palaces under the Sword Light Palace. The 7-star city was surrounded by mountains in all directions. So much so, in fact, that it was generally considered a mountain city. Countless magnificent palaces were lined up, one after the other, around the huge 7-star mountain. Looking down from the top of the mountain, people felt woozy. The lofty sword, 700,000 feet high, was stabbed into the mountain peak, emitting an indescribable aura. Even a powerful other shore realm warrior would feel a sense of solemnness and fear when the sword came into view. On the platform beneath the lofty sword, a middle-aged man dressed in cyan and wearing a cyan hat called out, "Disciples of the Burial Sword Palace, get onto the platform." Although his voice was low, it traveled for thousands of miles in pristine clarity. The platform where the middle-aged man stood actually stretched outward and connected to many other platforms, each of which could accommodate over 1,000 people. As soon as his voice transmitted out to the others, the center of the platform suddenly showed slight signs of space fluctuations. Buzz, buzz, buzz. In the blink of an eye, 300 disciples appeared on the platform, all at once. Every single one of them sat cross-legged, holding the same posture. The disciples were dressed in the same cyan clothes, and each of them emitted a sharp aura. From their eyes down to their gestures, they showed their arrogance on every level. They were the disciples of the Burial Sword Palace, and also the best group of talented disciples in the Sword Light Palace. It was no wonder they acted in such a way. "Disciples of the Demon Sword Palace, climb onto the platform," the middle-aged man called out once again. On another platform appeared 500 disciples, who were equally sitting in the same cross-legged position. The Demon Sword Palace was second only to the Burial Sword Palace. Over the years, it seemed that the Demon Sword Palace was about to surpass the Burial Sword Palace, but it hadn't quite happened just yet. These two palaces had been secretly competing against each other. As soon as the disciples of the Demon Sword Palace appeared, they looked at the platform where the Burial Sword Palace disciples were. Their eyes were full of provocation. "Disciples of the Broken Sword Palace, get onto the platform. Disciples of the Sword Anger Palace, get onto the platform." And this kept going. Disciples of different palaces appeared on different platforms, one after the other. The disciples appeared in numbers of hundreds. The middle-aged man looked at the smallest platform on one side. Just by the looks of it, it was several times smaller than the other platforms and could only accommodate about 100 warriors. This platform belonged specifically to the Sword Dance Palace. Back in the beginning, only 12 palaces existed in the Sword Light Palace, and this platform was later added for the Sword Dance Palace. Compared with other palaces' platforms, this one looked somewhat ridiculous in appearance. Nonetheless, although the platform was small, it had never been full in the past. Sometimes, the platform was completely deserted. In fact, after all, the disciples in the Sword Dance Palace weren't interested in cultivating. Even if the chance of observing the sword was very rare, they still wouldn't cherish it in the least. When it came to tradition though, the middle-aged man would still call them over. "Disciples of the Sword Dance Palace, get onto the platform." As the middle-aged man's voice spread out once again, waves of space fluctuation suddenly spread outward on the platform as well. Buzz, buzz. In unison, more than 40 people from the Sword Dance Palace appeared on the platform. The middle-aged man was rather taken aback upon seeing so many warriors appear on the platform at once. In fact, he had never witnessed such a scene before. As the other disciples watched their sudden appearance, they too portrayed expressions of confusion. The Sword Dance Palace disciples' bad reputation was known to the other palaces. The Sword Dance Palace disciples were arrogant and domineering, but they all had strong family backgrounds that couldn't afford to be offended. Fortunately, the 13 palaces were all established separately. The disciples from each of the 12 palaces wouldn't provoke the Sword Dance Palace disciples, and in this way, not many conflicts rose amongst them. In the past sword observing activities, most often, there weren't any disciples from the Sword Dance Palace in attendance. At times, there were 7 or 8 disciples attending the activity. They didn't observe the sword carefully, but clamored instead. More so, they had been expelled several times. Therefore, the Sword Dance Palace platform was completely empty the last 3 times. More than 40 people came here today, which made the others feel rather strange. Chapter 2595, The Lofty Sword. Kenom, Hyde, and 8 others were from the Excellent City. It was their first time seeing the lofty sword from such a close distance. Naturally, all of them were absolutely thrilled. The origin and legend of the lofty sword were known far and wide. Kenom and his friends heard about these stories from their families during their childhood. Once upon a time, the 7-star province was only known as a savage land. It was inhabited by only a few people and most of them were still uncivilized. Back then, the 7-star province was still being ruled by Jonas, a powerful unhuman monster. The size of his body was comparable to a huge mountain. His strength greatly exceeded the power of most other shore realm warriors of the human race. It was about 1,000,000 years ago when the lofty sword came down from the sky and nailed Jonas down to the 7-star mountain. The lofty sword belonged to a swordsman named Athamar Chu. He descended towards the 7-star province and vanquished Jonas. After that, he created the Sword Light Palace. For the next 1,000,000 years, the Sword Light Palace continued to reign over the entire 7-star province. It even expanded to some provinces surrounding it. It even had a huge influence on the inhabitants of the barren Gracious province. For this reason, most people from the Gracious province like Kenom dreamed about joining the Sword Light Palace someday. Zen started looking around as he sat cross-legged on the platform. The people from the other palaces, however, were all sitting elegantly. His gaze fell softly upon the lofty sword not far away from him. The main reason why they were observing the lofty sword was to understand the truth of eternal sword intent. Yet as of this moment, the sword didn't show its sharp aura which was supposed to radiate from it. Somehow, it seemed like it had been sealed by an invisible sword sheath. This sword really has a magnificent presence. Being an accomplished swordsman, Zen was well versed in the art of swordsmanship. When Laura brought Zen and the others into the 7-star city, the lofty sword had emitted a different kind of aura. It was much more unusual today compared to what they had witnessed before. The lofty sword he had been observing for quite a while now had possibly hidden its true aura. However, he knew that it was actually very similar to a dragon diving into the abyss. It could burst forth at any moment too. Therefore, it was far more frightening now than it had been before. I wonder if anyone in the Sword Light Palace is capable of controlling the lofty sword, Zen thought to himself. The other disciples like Fegan and Jago now appeared quiet and reserved. They had a bad reputation and seldom came here to observe the lofty sword in the past. They felt somewhat embarrassed at this moment. All of a sudden, they heard someone speak out from another platform. Are you serious? How come these pathetic fools from the Sword Dance Palace are here again? They are all dreadfully worthless. They should not have come here in the first place. Maybe they plotted this together. Are they planning to cause problems here? I wish the officiant would kick these idiots out of here and disallow them from observing the sword. The conversations they heard were from the disciples of the Demon Sword Palace and Burial Sword Palace. Some of those disciples were known as prodigies who resided in the 7-star city. There were also some who came from the Chu clan and Yubai clan. But they were from other branches, and they had extraordinary talents. As a result, they were practically unafraid of Fegan and his companions. Fegan and his friends had taken a lot of beatings from Zen these days. Therefore, they had fully submitted to his will. Nevertheless, they couldn't just sit idly by and ignore such hateful comments from the other disciples. Seething rage took over Fegan. He could not hold his tongue any longer, so he shouted, "Freeman Chu! What you're saying is a load of rubbish." Jago remained stony-faced as he admonished them. "I'm a disciple of the Sword Dance Palace. We are free to come here whenever we want to. Mind your own business." Freeman Chu continued to scorn them and said, "Don't you even dare think that the Sword Dance Palace is worth mentioning alongside the other 12 palaces. Ha ha, what a ridiculous thought. The Sword Dance Palace only has a group of pathetic and wretched people like you." The newest additions to the Sword Dance Palace like Zen, Kenom, Hyde, and their friends maintained their composure. They had no idea who these people were after all. The rest of the Sword Dance Palace disciples, on the other hand, were not able to stop themselves from reacting. How could they just let the other disciples make fun of their palace? No matter how poor it was the place they could call their own. On the spur of the moment, they stood from the platform and glowered at the disciples of the other palaces. In their fury, they seemed like they were about to start a fight. At this point, the middle-aged man on the platform got fed up with all the commotion. He yelled, "Didn't I invite all of you here today to observe the sword? Why are you making such a ruckus? Anyone who makes any kind of noise again will be thrown out of here at once. The middle-aged man was the officiant. He facilitated the observation of the sword. Furthermore, he occupied a high position in the sword-light palace. His voice commanded a certain authority. With irksome smiles upon their faces, the disciples of the Burial Sword Palace and Demon Sword Palace appeared satisfied. Meanwhile, Fagin, Jago, and the other disciples of the Sword Dance Palace returned bitterly in their respective seats. All they wanted was to observe the sword. They did not expect they would be insulted and made fun of. For now, just focus on reaching the other shore realm. The disciples from the other palaces can ridicule you all they want, but it will not matter. Your best retaliation would be to reach the other shore realm ahead of them someday, Zen whispered to his companions. As soon as they heard this, their faces were filled with cynical looks. We already attempted so many times before. But no matter how much we tried, we got easily bored with cultivating. We simply couldn't put our minds to it. It was not because these disciples lacked skill or expertise. They were prodigies too, otherwise, they wouldn't be able to have become consummate true gods at such an early age. What happened was, as they grew up, they got too preoccupied with distracting thoughts. And the love and care from their doting parents drove their goals and aspirations from their minds. It was thanks to the numerous and intense beatings they got from Zen that they started to change a little. Unfortunately, they were fully aware that their devotion and fervor would only last for a short while. When he heard what they said, Zen looked at Fagin and told him, "Is it really just because cultivating is boring? Personally, I disagree. I think you are just afraid of what will happen if you fail. Are you not? It scares you that people will think of you as someone who has no real talent. If that's the case, then you really are a coward." These statements from Zen temporarily stupefied Fagin, Jago, and others. Soon after, these words began to stir something deep in their hearts. It was true that they already gave up on themselves in the Sword Dance Palace. At the same time, they were still quite proud of themselves. For instance, Jago was determined to believe that he was not lagging behind Fu Manchu when it came to talent. Despite this, he refused to even prove himself. On the contrary, Zen stated that it wasn't simply because Jago declined to prove himself. In reality, he was merely a coward who didn't have the guts to challenge Fu Manchu. They were perfectly fine being known as playboys who were up to no good. But deep within their hearts, they still yearned to prove themselves to their own clans. Fagin and his companions were engrossed in their own thoughts. Suddenly, the officiant told everyone, "Ready yourselves. I am now going to activate the array." Hardly had the officiant finished his words when all the disciples of the 13 palaces took out the Truth of Eternal Sword Intent translations. Subsequently, the officiant sat down in the middle of the platform. His hands made some sort of movement, and orbs of pale cyan light emerged around him. Almost simultaneously, the energy around the lofty sword changed abruptly. The truth of godly way that had originally accumulated and formed into a sphere started to bloom. The truth of eternal sword intent gradually radiated from the lofty sword. Buzz, buzz, long and slender streaks of cyan light arose from the surface of the lofty sword. They wriggled and surged towards the disciples. A streak of cyan light shot towards the space between Zen's eyebrows. This made him squint a little. Before he could dodge it, the streak of light entered his mind. Chapter 2596, Truth Competition. Zen frowned dubiously. He hated anything else getting inside his head. After all, the Infinity Ruler was still in his mind. If its existence was found out by others, it might cause him some unnecessary trouble. Zen was slightly startled at the cyan thread drilling into his head. "Will this thing, you know?" he nervously asked. "No." 9527. Zen didn't need to complete his thought. Number 9527 knew what he was worried about. "Don't panic. This is just an illusion created by the sword with truth of eternal sword intent. This thread can't pry into your mind. Besides, the Infinity Ruler in your mind is just a delusional idea of Chiyu. It wouldn't be a big deal, even if it were discovered." Up until this point, number 9527 still thought the chances of integrating all kinds of godly ways were slim. Zen breathed a sigh of relief. The instant the cyan thread reached his soul, his surroundings suddenly changed. The officiant, the platforms, and the scenery in the distance disappeared in an instant. The only things that remained were the lofty sword in front of him, the disciples of the 13 cultivation palaces, and the translation of truth of eternal sword intent in their hands. What an illusion! The truth of eternal sword intent seems to have tangible existence. No wonder it is said that lofty sword can save the disciples half the effort. I feel my mind is so much clearer now. Kenom and his friends could not contain their excitement. They eagerly reached out to touch the cyan thread hovering in front of their foreheads. When the disciples of the other cultivation palaces overheard what they were talking about, their faces fell with disdain and disgust. Where did Sword Dance Palace get these nincompoops? It seems they have never been to such an event before. Sword Dance Palace is a dumpster. How can anybody expect them to recruit any talents? Just ignore them. Don't waste your time. The disciples of Burial Sword Palace and Demon Sword Palace shrugged at each other, sneering at Kenom and his gang. They then held up the translation in their hands and began reading it. Their voices were very loud and clear. The warriors of the land of the ancient swordsmanship have been exploring ways of cultivation since ancient times. Their eagerness to improve never ceases. It's the way to the prosperity of the world. They each recited at their own speed. However, with everyone reciting at varying lengths, together they sounded chaotic. Kenom held up the translation and stuttered, "The war our rears." In general, reciting the truth of godly way was difficult in itself. Moreover, it was Kenom's and his friends' first time to do so. What with the multitudes of voices echoing around them, how could they possibly concentrate? So, after but a few words, he was unable to continue reading. Zen observed this. He furrowed his brows, turning to ask Fagin, "Reciting the truth of godly way needs peace and quiet. Wouldn't the clamor of everyone reciting together be distracting?" Fagin smiled and shook his head gently. "Zen, you may not know this, but the 13 cultivation palaces compete against each other all the time. The competition between Burial Sword Palace and Demon Sword Palace is the most fierce. To cultivate the truth of godly way by reciting it has been approved by their leaders." "How come there are such strange rules?" Zen frowned. Fagin replied, "They argue that if a warrior really has an insight into the swordsmanship, they will naturally be single-minded and be unaffected by the others. But so far, the distraction has escaped no one. I don't know what idiot made these rules. Also," Fagin pointed at the sword. "Look at the huge sword. While cultivating, the disciples are simultaneously attacking each other. We call this truth competition." Zen's eyes followed where Fagin was pointing at, only to see that the wide sword had been covered with cyan threads, and each cyan thread was connected to a sword-shaped pattern. Those sword-shaped patterns varied in size. Some were as tall as a human, while some were as small as a pinky finger. "What do those sword-shaped patterns represent?" Zen asked, as he eyed the patterns of varying sizes. "They stand for the disciples, degrees of understanding of the truth of godly way. Look, mine is only as big as a palm. I can only recite 300 words. Zen, is this the first time you're cultivating the truth of eternal sword intent? That's why your pattern is only the size of a thumb," Fagin said with a chuckle. The lofty sword could only show the disciples' cultivation base in the truth of eternal sword intent. Zen had mastered truth of cultivation nature, but this truth of godly way couldn't be shown on the sword. This was why his sword pattern was so tiny. Zen followed the cyan thread with his eyes until he saw his own sword-shaped pattern was only the size of his thumb. "That's interesting," he said with a smile. Kenom's and his friend's sword-shaped patterns were only of the size of a pinky. Hyde Lu, on the other hand, seemed to have practiced truth of eternal sword intent before. His pattern was about the size of an index finger, a little longer than Zen's and the others. Suddenly, the sound of metal clanking rose above the clamor of the voices reciting. Zen looked up at the source of the sound and saw 2 human-sized sword-shaped patterns on the huge sword attacking each other. While they might have just been patterns, their collisions made the sounds of real blades clashing. At the same time, a disciple from the Burial Sword Palace and a disciple from the Demon Sword Palace suddenly stood up. The 2 biggest sword-shaped patterns were connected to the threads on their foreheads. They faced each other, chanting excitedly. "The 5 elements repel one another. The human race will never be exterminated. No. I cultivate with an earnest heart. Sticking to a righteous path, I resolve to become invincible and kill the evil." One of the 2 is Elgin Chu, and the other is Belden Yubai. They are a cut above the rest of the disciples in all the cultivation palaces. Elgin Chu is from the Burial Sword Palace, and Belden Yubai, from the Demon Sword Palace. Both come from big clans. They have always competed against each other every chance they can get. Now, they fight against each other in a truth competition. They don't think anyone else is good enough to fight against them. Fagin smiled wistfully, looking rather frustrated. Everyone hoped to take the spotlight, but they all knew no one was on the same level as Elgin Chu and Belden Yubai. Fagin couldn't help but feel a bit jealous. "We can take our time. As long as we don't stop, we can catch up to them, one step at a time," Zen said with a reassuring smile. Fagin shrugged but didn't try to argue. Finally, He opened the translation in his hand, reciting the truth of eternal sword intent in a low voice. On the main platform, after having activated the array, the officiant put his hands behind his back and stared at the lofty sword. The leaders of the cultivation palaces also arrived at this time. This group of disciples started their cultivation at the same time. Elgin Chu and Belden Yubai have surpassed the others by a lot, unsurprisingly. I'm afraid there's no way for the other disciples to catch up with them, said a petite woman as she observed the lofty sword. She was the leader of Sword Legend Palace. As she spoke, she watched Elgin Chu and Belden Yubai battle, a hint of regret glinting in her eyes. She had come to the realization that not recruiting Elgin Chu was her biggest mistake. What's with the Sword Dance Palace today? They have so many people present here. This is new, the leader of the Sword Anger Palace asked curiously. He paused to glance around. Well, I don't see Ingram. Why would he be here? Anyway, if the losers from the Sword Dance Palace don't work hard, he will never be able to earn respect from the Board of Elders in his life, said the head of the Sword Legend Palace, smiling coldly. However, the moment those words left her mouth, two figures floated over. The figures were none other than Ingram and Laura. Chapter 2597, Talent. Laura was the one in charge of the 13 cultivation palaces, making her the immediate superior of each palace. She was only second to the 3 elders and the current leader of the Swordlight Palace. The leaders of other palaces showed their respect as they all bowed to her as a sign of courtesy. The leader of the Sword Legend Palace approached her with a small smile and asked, "How is your talk going, Master Laura?" Glancing at her indifferently, Laura coldly replied, "It's none of your business." "Well, do you really think that we have to fulfill the promise?" inquired the Burial Sword Palace leader, Dalton Yubai. "Think about it. The 7-star province respects us for our good reputation. It is our duty to fulfill our promise. But more importantly, what does this have to do with you?" Laura questioned back. Right after Caspian's disappearance, the Swordlight Palace swore that if his tomb was to be found, then a new leader would be selected. Over the past years, the tomb remained undiscovered and the current leader had been ruling the Swordlight Palace ever since. Nobody had expected that today, Laura could reclaim her father's tomb. Staying true to their promise, they should choose a new leader. As of the moment, the Swordlight Palace was divided into 2 groups. Even the 3 elders could not get along with each other. 2 of the 3 elders were on the current leader's side, so they did not agree with the re-election. Because of this, the whole Swordlight Palace was at a dispute. Thinking of this, Laura was understandably not in a good mood at all. After rebutting the 2 leaders, she glanced at the platform where the Sword Dance Palace was located, showing a touch of concern in her face. Smiling, Dalton asked, "You came here today to see the new disciples of the Sword Dance Palace, yes?" Before she could say anything, the leader of the Demon Sword Palace interrupted and spoke, "They are nothing but ordinary divine citizens from the Gracious Province. Why do you even care about them? They have such mediocre talent and weak foundation. Recruiting them is a waste of resources. The Sword Dance Palace has long been a place for good-for-nothings and rascals of the streets. It's not a big deal to have more like them," Dalton insulted. Ingram heard this and could not help but give Dalton a grin. Dalton saw Ingram's little grin. Having a serious look on his face, he suddenly asked, "Ingram, is there anything wrong with what I said?" Raising his eyebrows, Ingram smiled and replied, "The Demon Sword Palace and the Burial Sword Palace have gotten the most resources, but you have only trained a few good disciples. In the past 200 years, almost all of the disciples who have been promoted to the Stinger Guards are good-for-nothings. Now, how dare you insult the Sword Dance Palace?" Ingram, Dalton's face darkened as he was offended. "Well, I'm just telling the truth. During the past 100 years, has any of your disciples been sent to the Oneness Sky Palace? Has any of them been promoted to Oneness Guards? No, but you still had the audacity to gloat. Shame on you," Ingram continued taunting. You, Dalton's face turned red with anger after he heard Ingram's statement. "What's wrong with me? Do you want to fight? Oh, come on, I'll show you. Let's fight if you want. You're incapable, that is why your disciples are nothing but garbage," Ingram remarked nonchalantly. What Ingram said brought shame to the palace leaders, turning their faces pale out of humiliation. Long ago, Ingram was qualified to join the Oneness Sky Palace. Although he had lived in seclusion for so many years, they were still no match for him. The once gloomy Laura didn't feel so bad anymore as she finally gave a soft smile. The officiant beside her said, "Ingram, this is the place to observe the sword, so watch your mouth." Touching his nose, Ingram snorted, "Meh. I just don't like them. The competition is about the disciples. talent and cultivation, not the strength of palace leaders, said the officiant. I guess you were right. We wholeheartedly cultivate talents for the Swordlight Palace, but this guy is criticizing us. How can we let that happen? We should speak up. He's vicious, Dalton said disdainfully, shaking his head. Smiling, Ingram turned to the platform of the Sword Dance Palace to look at Zen, with an expectant look on his face. You think that your disciples are talents? That's ridiculous. All along, Ingram thought that Zen was just like him. He came with Laura all because he wanted to see Zen, not for any other business. Suddenly, Dalton came to a realization and spoke. So, did you find a talent in the small gracious province for your Sword Dance Palace this time? Well, he is a little more talented than me, if you ask, said Ingram with a faint smile on his proud face. The faces of the palace leaders and the officiant slightly hardened at his words. The Swordlight Palace divided the talents of its disciples into 8 grades, and those with 6th grade talents could join the Oneness Sky Palace. Back then, Ingram's talent was classified as the 6th grade, and such a person was rare to be seen in the history of the Swordlight Palace. Knowing this, the palace leaders could hardly believe what he had just said. So who is this man you are talking about? Curious, Dalton asked. Find him by yourselves. At his words, all the palace leaders focused their eyes on the platform of the Sword Dance Palace, for they wanted to know if Ingram was bluffing. After all, people with 6th grade talents were rarely seen. When Zen practiced the truth of cultivation nature, he didn't resort to any external force, so he had met some difficulties along the way. Now when he was facing the lofty sword, he finally understood what Kennel meant. It was true that he could double the result by exerting only half the effort. But this would only be possible with the lofty sword's help. The warriors of the land of the ancient swordsmanship have been exploring ways of cultivation since ancient times. After he read some words on the translation, an idea popped into his mind. At that moment, he felt that his consciousness was integrated into the sword-shaped pattern on the lofty sword. He felt that he himself turned into a sword. It was as if his soul had come out of his body. Their eagerness to improve never ceases. It's the way to the prosperity of the world. As he continued to recite the words, the lofty sword slowly gave off the truth of eternal sword intent that soaked his soul. Zen had just started learning, so the knowledge of the truth of eternal sword intent was somewhat shallow. At that moment, he sensed that someone had actually led him to comprehend the truth of eternal sword intent, making the whole process smooth. Shortly after, he had already recited 500 words, and the sword-shaped pattern had grown larger and larger on the lofty sword. Now it was about half a foot long and was as thick as an arm. At that moment, the palace leaders' eyes were fixed on the platform of the Sword Dance Palace, waiting for something to happen. Finally, they found Zen's sword-shaped pattern. Surprised, Dalton stared at Zen and said, he must be the person Ingram mentioned. It's quite an amazing feat that he can recite 500 to 600 words despite that this is his first time learning the truth of eternal sword intent. However, the Burial Sword Palace also has a lot of talents like him. Let's not make a big deal out of it. Chapter 2598, Understanding Level. The voice of the leader of the Sword Legend Palace echoed through the air. Let alone the Burial Sword Palace and the Demon Sword Palace, even in our Sword Legend Palace, more than 10 disciples can pull that off. The leader of the Demon Sword Palace laughed and said, it's normal for Ingram to be excited. After all, the Sword Dance Palace is a place where a bunch of useless craps gather. When there suddenly appeared a disciple who looked somewhat better than the others, he began gloating. The other leaders of the cultivation palaces all agreed with her and smiled. However, Ingram just ignored their remarks and kept his gaze fixated on Zen. He rubbed his chin as he watched him from afar with curious eyes. Ingram believed Zen's potential was far more than what he showed. He was convinced Zen was a lot stronger than he was letting on. The sword-shaped patterns on the surface of the lofty sword gradually got bigger and bigger, and they continued to rise higher and higher. If a disciple encountered difficulties during their practice with the lofty sword and was stuck at a certain point, the sword would assist them by showing the corresponding truth of eternal sword intent. Under the influence of the truth of eternal sword intent, the disciples would feel enlightened from its support. This would aid them in overcoming their problems. Due to this, the speed of cultivation of the disciples from the Swordlight Palace was faster than that of the true gods outside who cultivated by themselves. Zen continued to put in efforts as he recited in a low voice, his eyes shining with determination. Normally during recitation, the further a person went, their speed of understanding would slow down and they would lose their momentum. But Zen was on a whole different level. If anything, his speed kept increasing. In fact, someone as talented as him didn't even feel the need of taking the lofty sword's support if he were to recite less than 2,000 words. Under the baptism of the truth of eternal sword intent from the lofty sword, Zen seemed to become stronger. 600 words, 800 words, 1,000 words. The eyes of the palace leaders were now glued to Zen. What Zen had achieved currently could be considered a small feat. In less than 5 minutes, Zen had done the impossible task of reciting more than 1,000 words. His talent was at a high level. He has recited over 1,000 words in 5 minutes. I suppose it might be something extraordinary in the Sword Legend Palace, but it's normal in our Burial Sword Palace, said Dalton, looking uneasy. He pretended to shrug it off. Ingram continued to observe without uttering a word. If Zen was only capable of this level, then he wasn't worth his attention. But he had a hunch that Zen's first attempt at this wouldn't stop here. His speed of reciting seems to be getting faster, the leader of the Broken Sword Palace said while leaning forward, now engrossed. The other leaders had noticed it as well. They watched in utter disbelief as Zen continued to surpass their expectations of him. In normal instances when warriors went through their cultivation of the truth of godly way, most of them would recite at a quick pace at the beginning and their speed would gradually decline as time passed. However, Zen was different. Instead of his speed lowering every second, it only became faster than the last one. It took Zen 3 minutes to recite the second 500 words. And it took him another minute to finish reciting the third 500 words. Difficult as the recitation of the truth of godly way was, he made it look like child's play. It was like he knew every word by heart. His voice was low and the place was noisy, but the leaders could still make out every word he said. Follow the command, use the bone and blood too. Zen's lips moved continuously, without a single pause. Each word was spoken clearly. 1,500 words. 1,700 words. 1,900 words. At this moment, Zen had managed to attract the officiant's attention as well. He peered over at the illusion and said, for the warriors who could recite 2,000 words in the first practice, their talent could be considered to have reached the 3rd grade. The expression on Dalton's face became serious. His forehead wrinkled as he spoke in a serious tone, warriors with 3rd grade talent cannot compare to Elgin of our Burial Sword Palace, but they are still rare. I didn't expect there would be such a talent in a barren province like Gracious Province. It's too early to say that, Ingram finally spoke. I have said that his talent is not inferior to mine. Dalton was still not convinced. He scoffed, don't get your hopes up. We have all cultivated the truth of godly way. Don't forget that Elgin recited 4,300 words back then. Just wait and watch. We'll see who's right in the end, Ingram said confidently. The light in Zen's eyes shone brighter and brighter. It was like his eyes were ablaze. He felt his voice echo with the lofty sword. Whenever he recited a sentence, the lofty sword would respond to him. The response from the lofty sword was not sound or words, but it was the truth of eternal sword intent. Why does my speed of understanding the truth of eternal sword intent far exceeds that of the truth of cultivation nature? Is it because I am extremely suitable for cultivating truth of eternal sword intent, or is it because of the lofty sword assisting me? Zen debated with himself as he tried to make sense of the situation. He could not believe how fast he was going himself. When he reached 3,000 words, he suddenly stopped with a confused expression on his face. The leaders were all on the edge of their seats. The moment Dalton saw this, he let out a sigh of relief. He looked at Ingram with a smile. It seems that there won't be any talent on a par with you in the Sword Dance Palace. Ingram and Laura glanced at Zen, looking equally confused. A while ago, he was reciting words at an alarming speed, but now he stopped. This made them feel strange. If he was struggling with words at some part of the truth of godly way, he would have collapsed by now. His soul would not be able to endure the burden. But, instead of looking miserable, he looked normal. Ingram and the others tried to make out what happened to him. What could have caused him to stop after doing so well? But Zen just paused for 9 seconds. He could not find the answers to his questions that were clouding his mind. They clogged his ability to think straight. Zen sighed and decided to let it go for the time being. Soon after, he began reciting the words again. However, this time his speed became inhumanly fast. Slowly, he began to enter the state of forgetting himself. It was like he was possessed. His low tone became high-pitched as he screamed out the words, and his voice pierced through long distances, reaching people far and wide. This alerted the other disciples of the cultivation palaces who were in the process of cultivation. Kenom had only recited dozens of words with the support of the lofty sword. He had already reached his limits, and he wasn't able to endure any more. The cultivation was beginning to weigh down on his soul, it was making him lightheaded. Every time he recited a word, he felt like his soul was being impaled by 1,000 arrows. When his body was exhausted from the exertion, Kenom decided to take a short break before falling to his knees. As he collected himself, he heard Zen's voice. Instinctively, he looked over at the direction it was coming from. Knowing how talented Zen was, Kenom assumed he might have recited 200 or 300 words at best. He looked along the cyan thread that was connected to Zen's forehead. Kenom squinted his eyes to see Zen's sword-shaped pattern on the lofty sword. He could not believe his eyes. His body trembled at the sight of it. Zen's sword-shaped pattern is now as high as half a person. A look of disbelief painted Kenom's face. Although he always knew Zen was a genius, he never expected him to be so gifted. Zen had already surpassed most of the disciples of the cultivation palaces in his first attempt. Kenom was not the only one who was watching Zen in utter amazement. Fegan, Jago and the other disciples from noble clans witnessed his incredible talent from afar. Before this, Fegan was content with his achievements. He even thought he was better than the other disciples due to having more experience of being a disciple of the palace. At least he was able to recite over 300 words, and his sword-shaped pattern was the size of a palm. But his sense of superiority over the others had only lasted for a quick quarter. Now Zen had left him far behind in terms of learning this truth of godly way as he kept progressing further. This guy, he really shouldn't belong to the sword dance palace. Fegan sighed in his heart as he felt defeated. Meanwhile, Zen's sword-shaped pattern continued to grow bigger and higher. Its size attracted the attention of the disciples from other palaces. These disciples were all full of themselves and thought they had the best talent. How could they tolerate Zen's pattern growing so rapidly compared to their own? They began to take offense at Zen's formidable strength. Several disciples from the Demon Sword Palace and the Burial Sword Palace took an unusual move. As they began reciting collectively, their sword-shaped patterns on the blade of the lofty sword surrounded Zen's sword-shaped pattern. Chapter 2599, Disciples' Gains. The truth competition was a must-have activity in the cultivation palaces. These sword-shaped patterns reflected the level of the disciples' comprehension of the truth of godly way. When disciples at the same level battled against each other in the truth competition, their desire to win would be aroused, and they would gain more insight about the truth of godly way in the process. In fact, it was common for disciples to make a breakthrough during the truth competition. For example, Elgin and Belden had been participating in the truth competition from the very beginning, and both of them had been trying their best to win. In just a short period of time, they had already surpassed a large number of disciples who had started cultivating at the same time as them, and become the most outstanding star disciples in the Swordlight Palace. However, the disciples whose sword-shaped patterns were gathering around Zen's were quite hostile to him. In particular, the disciples of the top two cultivation palaces, the Demon Sword Palace and the Burial Sword Palace, intended to uphold their reputation. They wouldn't be nearly as hostile toward Zen if he was from another cultivation palace. However, he was a disciple of the Sword Dance Palace, which was regarded by all the other disciples as nothing but a trash heap. Besides, Zen was not from the Chu clan or the Yubai clan. The fact that he was allowed to participate in the truth competition was like an insult to all of them. Overtake him and step on him. Force him to slow down. If he continues to move up, I will stop and defeat him. These several people had also comprehended more than 3,000 words of the truth of eternal sword intent. Their sword-shaped patterns were similar to Zen's, and some of them were even a little stronger. As the sword-shaped patterns gathered together, the aura around the lofty sword became several times denser. Bang, clank, clank, clank. When the sword-shaped patterns of the other disciples clashed against Zen's, crisp metallic sounds resounded in the area as if their weapons were physically colliding with each other. Wisps of truth aura passed through the cyan thread into Zen's soul. Ordinary disciples would have a tough time standing their ground if they were attacked by many people at the same time. They would feel a sharp pain in their heads and would have to stop. Zen, however, only slowed down a bit in the face of these attacks. He held a translation in one hand, and his voice became more and more sonorous. His sword-shaped pattern exuded a pure truth aura, sending the other sword-shaped patterns flying backward as soon as they came into contact with it. As the sword-shaped patterns scattered into the air, Zen's truth aura was transmitted to the minds of the several disciples through the cyan threads. Following that, a few screams came from the platforms where the disciples of the Burial Sword Palace and the Demon Sword Palace were. Those disciples squatted down and covered their heads with their hands, their faces contorting in pain. This guy, He is almost unhurt. Is it really the first time he's cultivating the truth of eternal sword intent? That's for sure. The lofty sword is never wrong. The sword-shaped patterns on the lofty sword reflected how much the cultivators had comprehended the truth of godly way. Now it seemed that Zen's sword-shaped pattern had grown really fast. Well, let's attack him too. If this guy really has a thorough comprehension of the truth of eternal sword intent, then it will also benefit us greatly. We might be tortured for a while, but maybe it will help us break through the bottleneck. Seeing this scene, the disciples who had comprehended over 3,000 words were now eager to challenge Zen as well. The reason why the Sword Light Palace encouraged disciples to take part in the truth competition was that they could absorb the truth aura from their opponents in the process. In turn, the comprehension of their opponents would also be imprinted in their minds. This way, they could make a faster breakthrough during the competition. The fiercer the opponent's attack was, the better the effect would be. Most disciples from the cultivation palaces would be able to comprehend about 3,000 words, but after that, they would be stuck at that stage for a long time. In general, it was very difficult to break through the bottleneck of the truth of godly way by using external force. At this time, they all changed their opinions about Zen. Their notions of suppressing Zen completely disappeared, and instead, they took him as a great tonic. With a fanatic desire, they rushed to him. As Zen read the translation, he glanced around and, to his shock, caught a glimpse of a group of sword-shaped patterns coming straight toward him all of a sudden. Were these guys crazy? Anyway, he had no choice but to react. What he had to do was to comprehend the truth of godly way at such a fast speed that his sword-shaped pattern would rise and leave the area where 3,000 words indicated. However, he was already reading at almost the maximum speed. How could he dodge the sword-shaped patterns coming toward him? Cling, cling, cling. Over 10 sword-shaped patterns surged toward Zen one after another. Each time, there was the crisp sound of swords colliding with each other, followed by the scream of a disciple. A strange spectacle suddenly appeared on the platforms of the 12 cultivation palaces. The disciples on the platforms were shrieking in pain while covering their heads with their hands, and some of them passed out from the pain. 2 of them even lost their balance and plummeted toward the abyss. Of course, the palace leaders wouldn't really let their disciples fall into the abyss. The officiant of the Sword Light Palace watched this scene in utter awe. This disciple called Zen seems to have a natural affinity with the truth of eternal sword intent, he remarked breathlessly. It's not just the affinity. His soul is also very powerful. After all, he has been in the sea of truth, Laura pointed out with a hint of appreciation in her voice. For anyone else, it would have been almost impossible to avoid so many attacks at the same time. However, since Zen had been in the sea of truth, he could resist their attacks with his own soul. Ingram nodded in agreement, but added, although his soul is powerful, he still won't be able to easily withstand attacks with just his soul. As soon as he finished his words, a voice full of surprise came from the platform of the Burial Sword Palace. Haha, I got it. The man who had spoken was Wade Yubai. He was the first disciple of the Cultivation Palace to challenge Zen. Just now, when his sword-shaped pattern had hit Zen's, the truth aura had shot into his mind and produced a sharp pain, as if it was ripping his soul apart. However, when the pain finally faded away, he realized that he had been enlightened. After he had comprehended 100 words, his progress had been at a standstill for 2 whole years. After attacking Zen, however, he had been able to make a breakthrough easily. It was no wonder he was so excited. He almost couldn't wait to sit down cross-legged and silently read the translation. At this moment, his sword-shaped pattern on the lofty sword really started to grow. And he wasn't the only disciple that this had happened to. 2 other disciples had also gone through the same experience. With an incomparable excitement, they began to verify the comprehension in their minds. What? The leaders of the cultivation palaces were shocked by the peculiar behavior of these 3 disciples. In order to make it possible for their disciples to enter the sea of truth, the palace leaders had done everything they could to cultivate them. However, no matter how much effort they put into it and how many methods they used, they hadn't been able to achieve their goal. Now, to their surprise, it seemed that these disciples had broken through the bottleneck just by competing against Zen during the truth competition. Maybe it's just a coincidence that these 3 disciples were able to make it. Dalton, the leader of the Burial Sword Palace, said in a low voice. Chapter 2600, Breaking the Record. Not long after Dalton finished speaking though, a second batch of disciples who also launched the truth competition towards Zen were enlightened. Their reactions were exactly the same as those of the first 3 disciples. They were surprised at first and then immediately concentrated on reciting the truth of godly way in order to verify their ideas. There were anywhere between 20 and 30 disciples in the second batch. It was far from a coincidence that each of them broke through the bottleneck, one by one. Can our disciples break through their bottlenecks after sparring with Zen? Someone asked. Why is the truth of godly way he infuses so magical? Someone else chimed in. It's proof that the way he apprehends the truth of eternal sword intent is very unique, and unbelievably precise. In that very instant, everyone was astonished, even the officiant. With his mouth slightly agape, he asked, how could this have happened? He had been in charge of the sword observation for such a long time now, and over all these years, never had he seen such a bizarre occurrence. The palace leaders were equally surprised, but rather delighted. Zen had helped dozens of disciples break through all at the same time, and that had been a great aid to the cultivation palaces. He should be a perfect match for the truth of eternal sword intent. His truth aura is so perfect that it's actually pure when left in other disciples' minds during the truth competition. It has an excellent effect. I've heard of it once or twice before, but it has never occurred directly in our sword light palace, Laura stated indifferently. The lofty sword could respond to the disciples with the matched aura of the truth of eternal sword intent. Nonetheless, the lofty sword's guide lacked flexibility in the end. At this point, Zen was on the same page with these disciples, having comprehended over 3,000 words too. So the truth he had comprehended was what these disciples needed most, making the fight with him more effective than the lofty sword itself. The leader of the Demon Sword Palace blinked her eyes a few times and came up with an idea. Can we ask Zen to stop comprehending the remaining words and stay at this stage for a while? She asked. Many disciples of the cultivation palaces had been trapped within this stage. If Zen stayed at this level, the disciples' cultivation speed would greatly improve in the future. Regardless, this remained a shameless idea. No one was willing to delay their own cultivation for others. Everyone only thought of themselves. Even Dalton thought this suggestion was an unacceptable one, and thus, he chose to remain silent instead. Upon hearing the suggestion, Ingram sneered and said, Charlene, do you really think the disciples of your Demon Sword Palace are superior to the disciples of my Sword Dance Palace? I'm afraid that all the losers from your Demon Sword Palace aren't even worth a single Zen. Hearing what Ingram had said, Charlene felt embarrassed. She replied coldly, I'm just making a proposal. Besides, Zen only joined your Sword Dance Palace less than a month ago, am I right? He is nothing more than an outsider. I've done all of this for the Chu clans, the Yubai clans, and even the entire Sword Light Palace's sake. Oh really? Now, I'm afraid that we can't keep Zen in the Sword Light Palace. If you really think this is a good idea, you can go and tell Zen himself in person. If Zen can gain his reputation in the Oneness Sky Palace in the future, you'll face all the trouble caused by him alone. What do you think about that? Asked Ingram with a cold smile pressed on his lips. As he finished speaking, Charlene's face darkened. She ultimately chose to keep silent. She knew that Zen wouldn't agree to this unless she put pressure on him, in the name of the Sword Light Palace. In this way, she knew she'd completely offend him. On the platform, Kinelm, Hyde, Fegan and Jago, in a foolish manner, watched Zen recite the truth of eternal sword intent. Zen, don't you have a bottleneck? Questioned Kinelm, slightly dazed and confused. All things considered, he himself had hit a wall at the point of only 12 words. As far as I know, no one in the Excellent City has been capable of doing such a thing, including the City Lord, mentioned Hyde, sporting a complicated expression. That makes sense. The Lord of the Excellent City is nobody. There are many people who haven't encountered bottlenecks after comprehending over 3,000 words in our Sword Light Palace. Among this batch of disciples, Elgin and Belden both can fulfill the latter. And if I remember correctly, Elgin's record was 300 words at his first time and Belden's was 250. Correct me if I'm wrong, of course, said Fegan. Wow, that's amazing, incredible. The Sword Light Palace really does have many talents, exclaimed Hyde in an excited tone. In comparison, the talents in the small Excellent City, or even the Gracious Province, were hardly worth mentioning at all. Wrapping his arms around himself, Jago smiled and said, yes, but we know Zen is different. I have a feeling he might break Elgin's record. As everyone continued talking among themselves, Zen passed the threshold of 800 words and went straight for 4,000 words, still in continuous recitation. As Zen's sword-shaped pattern continued to grow and climb higher and higher on the lofty sword, the number of disciples on his level only continued to decrease, and so did the number of disciples coming to Zen for the truth competition. Still, some strong disciples wouldn't let go of such an opportunity, especially once they became aware of Zen's uses. Almost everyone above Zen's level controlled their sword-shaped patterns in an attempt to wait for Zen. In other words, Zen's sword-shaped pattern kept going upward through constant truth competitions, which only added a certain level of difficulty to the task. 4,000 words. It truly appears that he might actually break both Elgin's and Belden's records. Do you really think he can break them? At first, both Elgin and Belden were engaged in the fierce truth competition. The truth of eternal sword intent was written in 9,449 words. Now, the two of them had already comprehended over 9,000 words. They were only a step away from driving the soul of light to enter the sea of truth that they had dreamed of. Both of them now had their sword-shaped patterns appearing at the top of the lofty sword, leaving the other disciples far behind. Currently, the number 3 disciple had reached just under 7,000 words. What Elgin and Belden cared about the most, however, was keeping their own records. As he learned the truth of eternal sword intent for the first time, Elgin's record was 4,300 words and Belden's was 4,250. Their records could be in the top 30 even when compared with those of the disciples from former batches. Elgin and Belden were satisfied with the result, and this could be read in their expressions. Of course, never had they thought any disciple could surpass their records. Today though, a new disciple in the Sword Dance Palace had broken through the 4,000-word mark. This amazed them to an even greater extent. Disciples of the Sword Dance Palace, except for those from the big clans, are all mediocre people who came from small places. How can there be such a person this time? Asked Belden, his eyebrows furrowed. Another disciple beside Belden said, it's said that this batch of new disciples came here because they had discovered the former palace leader's tomb. I wonder if that guy has received a certain kind of blessing from the former palace leader.